You know what time it is? Do you know what time it is? What time is it, Curtis?
I think it's time for Curtis and
Xirtus.
what?
That was more of a question, but yeah, I guess so. It is. It's time. So I'm gonna share this link in the Element server. Might be the right thing to do, and I'll send you a copy of it too. View on YouTube. All right. So part of the deal is I haven't gotten this stream fully cemented in Odyssey yet, but we will have this recording on there. And this is live. Telling people in the Uber meme chat. Actually, let me do a screen share so you see people see what's going on. That might be worth showing. So and we'll do your screen share too. But yeah, let's say we go to, guys, check out. This is Element. So we have a bunch of different groups. Review, it's us. Okay, if you go to 77 new thing, go to the community. You see the Tartar community. That's plus Tartar :matrix.org. Plus Tartar is any community. So we have the Tartar community, and then there's tons of groups, rooms rather. And there's, it was like 2 people in each room, and now there's 74 and 64, and but they're not all simultaneous. You have to choose which rooms you want to be in, and some of these rooms are moderated by some of the Glogolithics and chroniclers and the librarious people that were in the Tartary Discord. So this is just a huge, awesome boom. We didn't even have all of this fully figured out a couple days ago, and now it's really incredible to be able to watch it. But I wanted to post the link, so I went to Uber Memes. I just posted it in. Uber Memes is kind of like we have 100,000 people in philosophy memes. We have 10,000 people in advanced philosophy memes. But yeah, Uber philosophy memes is even more awesome. So that's cool. I'm going to post this link here. This is live with Curtis. Or I should say Curry Hobo, because that's your handle. And Andreas Xirtus. Okay. So, and I can do that in different pages, but I think it's the best place is to put it in, and I can type here and get people to see it. So,
Sorry about that. That was
yeah, you should be you big bully. Okay, so I'm gonna remove my screen, and then I'll put on your screen. Oh my gosh, are those tablets? They look kind of like Tartarian tablets.
Yes, they seem to have been inscribed or inscribbled with something.
Dude, scribbling is really interesting. I'm in a club of people that, and I think you might be in this too. Maybe you're not, but people who write those books that are they're nonsense words. They're just scribbles, like filled with phonemes that are made up, symbols that they're working. Like I know people that write like hundreds of pages of some fake language, and then they have like groups of we share these, and people sell books of just scribbles. I mean, what do you think about that? Is that crazy?
Yeah. We briefly mentioned Alison Gray, who does all these paintings where she's sort of channeling basic language like symbolism without a direct structure or alphabet, just kind of flowing with shape play. Is there too much? Can you do the shared screen?
For a second there, I thought maybe 2 Curtises was awesome, but I tried doing a close-up Curtis, and there's no microphone on close-up Curtis. There's only a microphone on Curry Hobo.
Yeah, you don't want a microphone on both.
Yeah, I mean, that'd be echoey. So they say that you're Canadian. I don't know if this one's true.
I'm a Turtle Islander mostly.
Truth Fairy says you're Canadian. I think Turtle Islander is definitely more accurate. I mean, I never heard of you to be like living on a seaboat in the Canadian Sea. So
that's all Canada is, apparently. It's just a bunch of waters.
The way you say it, that's all Canada is, just a bunch of water. Like a real landmass. Man. Well, but the real crazy part is when you find out everything's a bunch of turtle islands too, right? So, what's even going on? Well, I want to pull up your tablets a bit more because this is interesting. What drew you to being interested in drawing these tablets? What's going on?
Well, I was just I've been doing these what I call scribography, which is where I either listen to a conversation or engage in a conversation and draw as much as I can in the process, and then afterwards I tend to clean it up. Sometimes I'll break down really complex information in this way, and sometimes it's just really scribbling. It's like taking notes in class when you're bored and you don't even care. You just turn off your brain and your hand does it automatically. And so I was thinking about a lot of things you've been saying and that I've been hearing you talk about on other podcasts, just about history and how unbelievably beautiful, and like how so many different places on Earth have commingled and coalesced in ways that we don't even think about, and how that appears in language. And I'm also teaching my daughter how to draw and telling her what a circle is and what a triangle is and what a square is. And so I'm really, I think you're the right person to start asking these questions with, of like, how does symbolism develop? The earliest imagery we know of is cave paintings in France, right?
My God, thank you. So that's exactly where we need to go with this is, why does art start? What makes a human, at least, do art? Because we know that there are animals that paint. We've gotten monkeys and gorillas to paint. But there's something about human nature that's being expressed, and you have to decide, are they expressing creativity or fear? And that's a big thing with humans, is we think often that, there was a war and they were afraid, but it's like, like some of the oldest stories about the cave paintings in France are that they were like warnings, like, oh man, I saw this giant monster, look out, like a caution sign. Like, and we have symbols like deers crossing here. But, again, it's deers crossing here, and be aware of the bear, as I can't remember if that was Aldous Huxley, Tom Wolfe, I think, writes about that. And then Ken Kesey says it's not to be afraid of the bear. The sign says to be aware of the bear. So really, there's also a movie with John Goodman called Matinee, where a guy comes to town during the Cuban Missile Crisis and he starts making horror films about giant ant people. And his whole story is that cave drawings are the first horror films. Not that horror films are designed necessarily to scare you, but in terms of archetypical masculine stories, like a feminine archetypical story is often like a horror film as well. If there's a lot of feminine horror, and we should differentiate the idea of the hero's epic, where a guy is like, he's so strong and brave, but really he comes off as a little kid who just rises. He's not special. It's like a young prince who's like orphaned often, and then he comes up against this whatever the problem is, it's the biggest problem in the world. Whatever it is, it's the biggest problem anyone's ever faced, and he faces it. It doesn't matter what it is, doesn't matter how scary it is, he faces it. Good for him, and that tends to be the ancient stories. Like, a hero makes it through the biggest problem ever, and they want to like advertise about it. The other one is like, this was so bad that I was paralyzed by this. I couldn't make choices. And that's the feminine archetype of like being forced and what it feels like. And like a lot of horror films for that reason sell to the feminine audience. And, couples go to horror films, and, it's weird to know, but women prefer horror films than men do. More women do. So there's been a lot of, questions about, and then there's also the power of symbols, and you're just showing right now like the death rune, which has become the peace sign, and then you've got the Star of David, which is two triangles, as above so below, like two pyramid schemes. Like, there's another one working the other direction. There's the propeller, or the Gomadian, the thing that the Germans have made look bad, but the Indians have made all about peace and about vegetarianism and not killing. And it's like, how do you decide when you flip a symbol? Like, you could easily see how Hitler flipped the symbol, but we don't talk about how we flipped the Lieben rune to make the peace sign, and it's the same idea. Like, the hippie movement is built on the exact same idea as the Germans, like taking a symbol and flipping it. Only instead of an Indian symbol, they literally took a German rune. But I digress.
Have you seen this one? Do you know what this one means in Sumerian cuneiform?
No, tell me, is that a math thing?
No. Okay, so what I find interesting about cave paintings versus clay tablets is cave paintings, like you said, are like epic stories. There's these narratives. Oftentimes the undulates that are painted on the walls have 12 sets of legs, as if to say they're animated, as if they're running. So it really is like almost literature. It's almost animation. But then we get to these clay tablets, which are almost always financial ledgers. They're either receipts or exchanges. So this is a symbol that was on early tablets. It's divided into two. These little bumps are hills, and when you arrange three of them in this way, it means a mountain. The triangle you see on the left-hand side means a female, a girl, a fertile woman. And when you combine these two symbols, it means a foreign girl which culturally often would be understood to mean a slave girl. So that's how symbols were arranged and combined to.
Intuitive too. Like if you had asked me like to demand a guess, then the first guess would have been that that's a vaginal symbol, you know, because it's an upside down triangle. And then in terms of the hills, like it literally is the simplest possible explanation. So, but when you combine the symbols together, you know, to get an inferred message, it's kind of like what the Chinese are still doing, and it makes a lot of sense for trade. Where did you find this set?
I was listening to a lecture about cuneiform, and it came up. And, you know, I just put it equals wheat because these were the types of exchanges they would do. It'd be like, okay, here's my crop. So many slaves plus so many cows equals so many bags of nuts. And, you know, and a lot of it was debt-based, you know, it wasn't necessarily a receipt of an exchange, but it's like, here's what you're going to owe me come spring for the slave I give you today.
I find it really interesting, the blanked out Tartarian tablets you have, because you've removed the writing from the Tartarian tablets, as far as I can tell.
And yeah, I've diminished it. Do you know what it means? Because I don't.
Yeah, we're going to have to go into that. Before we do, though, I want you to tell me about what is written in the square between your drawing, your cave drawing, and your Sumerian cuneiform. On the
this one
left
here?
side of the light here, this big grid. What's that grid about?
This is interesting. This one says Toteria. I'm not actually sure. I just kind of pulled this off the old internet, and I'm not sure what these symbols mean, to be honest. I think what this is mostly describing is how symbols become simplified over time. Maybe this is an even better example of it.
You have not blocked out those tablets. I can see when you get closer that it's there. It's just hard to read because it's lightly written on the tablet.
Well, see, I thought I could scribble over it as we go, because I'm not sure what these symbols mean.
This is the fun part. Okay, so what they tried to teach me in school was that everything, all civilization, was built on war. And they wanted us to believe this. They were very convinced that war causes people to work together and to hide information, etc. But like most of the time, when you look for exceptions, and you'll find them. There's mostly exceptions to that rule. And it's not that the society is built on war. Most of it is that war is a response to trade having a famine. And so when there's a crisis, environmental crises, then the famine will happen and it'll exacerbate the problems. But when you look at these tablets, it had exactly the same, Groznytsa tablets in Bulgaria, similar, have the same kind of idea where you see animals and you see grains and you see certain kinds of math it looks like a trade agreement. As far as I can tell, this is another example of a trade agreement between, a person or a farmer of some kind and someone who's growing plants and someone who's raising sheep. So a shepherd and a farmer are trading resources. And what's interesting is that it looks like what they're doing is they're trading futures. It looks like a prediction market coin. And this is a hand-minted coin. So this is very similar to the idea of how Bitcoin works, right? Like you have a very unique coin that no one else has a copy of except for it's shared. It could be duplicated with a stamp, but that might be even used to stamp in wax, from pig's fat and candle wax and same kind of thing into notes, and you can notarize
the original blockchain.
Right. And it could be a blood deal, all this thing with a stamp like that, you could be using whatever kind of ink you want. But with this stamp, and so it could easily be that the symbol's backwards, is my point. But the symbols, what they represent is a futures prediction of how much, based on this term, this quarter, or this season, this harvest, it's likely that the next harvest will have. And so we're looking at saying it's like and usually how this works is the farmer knows kind of based on what's going on, and the shepherd knows kind of, but they've both been raised. They're both men of the world, or persons of the world, and so they've learned Mendelbrot living math enough to know that likely there will be as many branches as there are on one tree, and as long as that one branch is, there will be a ratio of mass to represent that many branches as that many trees. And there will be, you can kind of predict from one tree next year how many trees there will be around it because of fractal math and how many blossoms there will be and how many fruit there will be. The same thing with shepherds. Shepherds usually can tell you, they've had 7 kids or lambs for their sheep or goat. And so likely there will be the same amount. Pretty commonly, they'll have repeating numbers. And you can usually tell from one how long they'll live. And there's a lot of like patterns that they can predict. So these 2 future predictions are asset trades in the positive reciprocity. So there's negative reciprocity, there's neutral reciprocity, and there's positive reciprocity. In cultural anthropology, we consider neutral to be where somebody does not gain from the exchange, but they do not lose from the exchange. In a negative relationship, one of the partners has a loss in the trade, right? And this is kind of like the idea of Manhattan being traded for buttons for your jacket. Is a negative, reciprocally negative trade. A positively reciprocal trade is where both are benefiting, because in this circumstance, in this scenario, one person's saying, I don't have the sheep you have, and I could use a fraction of that, but I have such an abundance of land, of trees, of fruit, that I could exchange my fruit, at least a fraction of that, for a fraction of your lambs. And so we can't be sure how much exactly there will be, but we can kind of predict these futures. And so it's fascinating to me mainly that this is a futures trade from so many thousands of years ago, because it could have gone the other way. And we've seen other kinds of talismans through the ages, which are all about war and are all about violence and etc. But the oldest thing you see, like Hammurabi's code, is all about peace and kind of uniformity of harmonization of law, so that people can make actions and choices, go to forums and make free common market decisions. And this coin kind of like represents that idea that trade comes before war.
Trade comes before war. I didn't quite grasp the connection there.
So like if you meet a stranger, the question is, are two strangers more likely to fight each other in the wild or make a trade in the wild? And for a long time in civilization and by professors, it's been quite common to say that men are more likely to create violence in nature, like Lord of the Flies, than they are likely to trade and to work together. But there's logic to people being individuals and trying to have autonomy, but there's also a lot of evidence that in crises people work together because the enemy of their enemy becomes their friend. And so both of them are working against a environmental disaster per se, or a lot of the time people do work together. There's ample evidence of that as well.
It's like survival of the most symbiotic, the most collaborative.
I think that trade and collaboration is even a better word. Trade is maybe an economic description of what happens. Reciprocity, like we were saying, there's exchange made. I think a lot of the time that's natural. And you can look at examples all the way from, the 1800s, the Native Americans, when we were interacting with them, they were all about Indian trading, right? Native American trading. That goes back to like ancient times. We see that as we start to follow the lineage of society, it's more often about trade than it's about war, and war tends to be the limiting factor for cultural growth.
So looking back, like here's a picture of what Sumerian cuneiform became, and it's very symbolic or very abstracted from its symbolism. It's just dashes, it's just verticals, and it's like computer code almost. You could probably actually get a computer to run on Sumerian cuneiform in some way. So I'm curious, like, is there any symbols that come to your mind when you think about this time in history that were very profound or very meaningful in terms of the evolution of written language?
Oh, I mean, it totally depends on where you want to start. I mean, if you want to look at European writing, I guess one of the first things I would like to bring up is Glogolithic. Glogolithic is a language that was concocted by Slavs in Croatia, but it's like how jazz musicians might take a riff from a rock song or a pop song. Basically, Glogolithic has symbols from Hebrew, from Phoenician, from Sanskrit, from Arabic, from Germanic languages, and Cyrillic, Tartar, I mean, the whole thing is just a jazz of all of the lessons learned in the 1300s or 900s. And so it's pretty cool. It's a pretty cool language that has a lot of symbols that are beautiful, and they look like church writings. If you've seen church books in the Middle Ages, a lot of time they're written in a Glogolithic script. I can probably.
Is that how you spell it? Did I spell it right?
You spell it like glog? Glog?
Yeah, Glogoli.
That sounds about right.
Glog. I've been glogging. I'm writing a glog.
Okay, so how do let's see, stop screen, add new screen.
Hey, are you recording, by the way, or just broadcasting?
I'm recording, yeah.
Excellent.
Well, same idea.
Yeah, so long as you can send me a copy or I can download a copy, we're all good.
Yeah, bro, for sure.
Yeah, it's 2001. We got it.
All right, so check out this language, right?
Ooh, I like this.
Yeah, dude. And then check out this. So when I was a kid, we went to Croatia and I saw this, and then I saw the physical thing, kind of like a rune stone, and I was like, what is it? And the answer being that it is a contract again. And this is a contract between, I think it has to do with land and boundaries and sheep again. And so I find it kind of funny that was also kind of where I got the idea that, I think that this might go back a little further than people realize, because why would you write down a military contract is only useful in times of treaties, right? So it becomes about trade anyway. So most of these contracts are about, they could, the other option is they could be religious. You could always say, you look at Sanskrit and they're like, we love the gods, so we have to speak Sanskrit. And like, this is a big thing with Glogolithic too, is that it's a language that's clearly a spiritually charged language. And it has that going for it. But it's not the only thing it is. It's mainly valuable as a trade language because you're able to communicate. And when you can, actually, are you able to see, is this just one tab open? How does that work?
I'm seeing your, I'm only seeing one tab where you are doing it in the church on Glogolithic.
But yeah, it's a pretty interesting looking script, and it has kind of a cross between Alien and Cyrillic and Phoenician. But look at this crazy Gaelic. You can see the Tartarian Gaelic connection there, where the Galatians language really made its way into Celtics. So Glogolithic is another way to put that, but lithic is fine too. And what was another good one I was going to show you? Mayan script. I'm
going to be back in 2 seconds, okay?
Jeez, is he all right? Poor guy. So doesn't fall. Well, so guys, I'll post this on my channel later, but I'm still having issues with the main channel, and so I would be doing this on Odyssey directly, but we're still getting through all the stuff to make the podcast do everything properly and I'm almost ready to go with Streamlabs slobs, but just not quite yet. So for now, we're just going to do stuff, and we're going to keep advocating that you try StreamYard. Also, yeah, the Mayan script. I think he's back. What's up, Curtis? How you doing?
So do you have a sense of like at what point or in what way these symbols became connected with phonetic language? Because a lot of it is pictorial, but then they also, down here I kind of have this thing about Sanskrit, like they would represent syllables or sounds as well as sometimes particular symbols. And also these sounds were related to their understanding of the chakral system.
Yeah. Okay, so let me tell you. So the Mayan script's a good start for that, actually, because it's the one that's the anomaly, right? So we've got a 5,000 letter alphabet. 2,500 to 5,000 is in the original.
It looks like modern art.
It is kind of like modern art, but so that's a big thing too. Okay, so hold on. So in a Phoenician language, like a phoneme-based language, and Phoenician's not a culture, it's just like a description of cultures. Like Tar is like the capital of, actually, you know what? Tripoli is the capital of Libya. I was thinking about that the other day. Like there's a whole bunch of weird stuff about that too. But
Mhm.
in a phoneme based language where you're recording sounds, there's so many sounds you can do, like only so many. So you probably end up with maybe like 46, 70 if you're really crazy. I've seen, I think, one Indian language that had like 120 sounds, and it was like they're all the same sound. Calm down. Like they're not, because there's like the way you might ask a question mark or a period. We have tricks though to make a lot of the sounds. You don't need a bazillion symbols, a Glogolithic symbols. So you could have like 26, and that's what we ended up with. But like you look at Sanskrit's like 46, and then there's like 20 vowels. Was it 12 vowels and then 46 consonants, something like that. So, but in Chinese, it's 2,500. Okay, in Chinese, there's like 100 important like you have to learn symbols. And then once you learn maybe 250, like 100 though, you can from there you can start combining them, and you might have like the mouth with the window makes the mountain. There's like you start to learn how they put together pictures that represent symbols, and that's a lot of what happened to Sumerian with the marks. The marks become kind of binary code in a way, like they're object oriented code. It's like an object that represents, is represented by a certain amount of notches. In Cherokee, in Cherokee is kind of arguably a new language. We'll go in Cherokee soon. Basically, with the Mayan language, though, the deal is there's like 500 symbols, which is too many to be a phonetic language, but not enough to be a symbolic language. Because for a symbolic language, you need to have thousands of symbols because you have to be able to combine them together. But with a phonetic language, you don't need that many symbols. So 500, 400, 250, it just doesn't make sense. And so what we ended up figuring out was, and this was a kid who was growing up in the Mayan temples, through anthropologists. He was noticing the symbols and he was like, wait a second. Okay, there's animals that have certain sounds they make. And then there are double combined shapes that interact together. And he started to realize that this is both a phonetic language and a symbolic language. And that's where they started cracking the Mayan code and figuring out that that's why they do this, because there's two kinds of audience. One is that, you can get a scribe to memorize autistically symbols, but what if he dies? What if you need someone else to understand it? So there's a secondary level there that's meant to be understood by a more or a less intuitive audience. But you can still figure it out. And so because of that, now we're retroactively going back and looking at Mayan and talking to Mexicans who still speak Mayan based languages, because there are still a few people that sort of know some of this in Oaxaca. And we're actually doing our best. And there's schools that are trying to keep it going in Mexico, which is cool. So they're doing a lot to try to keep it alive. And from that, they're learning a lot of things, because there's actually like thousands of books. A lot of them are in France or in Italy or in the Czech Republic or Spain, especially, because they were taken. But there are more books than we thought there were from the Mayan script. And at one point, we thought there were only 3 books left.
So if you were to guess what this image you've been focusing on is telling us, what is being communicated here, if you could guess? Other than animals are cool.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. That was a great question. I was going to say, so first thing is there's a couple things I already kind of know about Mayan, so that kind of screws up that inference. But with Mayan, these dots and these lines represent, first off, 1, 2 beyond 0. So this might be 3. And then this is 5 as a straight line plus 1 is 6. So you've got 3, or 2 to 3 or 6, and then you have 3, and then you have 9. So could be someone's phone number for a booty call. First off.
Okay, but what are these weird creatures telling us?
Right. Okay. So then the next thing is you've got above it this calendar code, because you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Right. So it's an 18 count with 3. So there's 3 6s. So that's already interesting right there, as they're using a sexadecimal sexadecimal message in 3s. And the different animals, you've got like birds a lot, and you have these kind of scary animals underneath them. So I would think this has to do with gods and maybe space, like whatever kind of. That's where I would draw the line of what I could be inferring. I wouldn't go too much further than that without looking into some of the other. But you can get like books on now in the last couple of years what they've inferred these things represent. But you see, like, there's birds and serpents a lot. So they probably have to do with certain sounds that the birds make. That tends to be what we found from the phonemes of the Mayan script. So that it makes it hard. You can't fully understand this unless you live in that environment so that you can hear the sounds that these symbols are making, right?
It's interesting that I'm asking you to describe the scripture.
Yeah, no, but I'm saying it's cool in that sense that in order to understand it, you can, but you have to literally be there because the symbols have to make sounds that you have to hear. You know, if you don't know what that animal sound makes, theoretically it could be lost forever, right?
Yeah. Can you jump back to my screen for a moment? The thing I'm thinking now is all of these things that we're talking about up to this point are either tablets or scrolls. Maybe on papyrus, and then early paper was being developed from hemp and other plants. Hebrew and Sanskrit. I don't know what this language is, but it looks beautiful.
So Sanskrit's weirdly late because Sanskrit they were speaking it a lot, but they didn't end up writing it down for a long time.
And then we see the emergence. Wikipedia is probably wrong, but it tells me this is the year that we see the first real, what's called an illuminated manuscript, which means an illustrated manuscript. Illuminated means it's been brought into light through drawings.
Well, I like that for a couple reasons. I mean, one, the most like far out of the flamenco timeline theory is basically that 868 could be 1868, which if you start to think about all the hidden hands after the war and what's been going on in the 700s and 1700s, like it is kind of a tempting like my thought experiment to think about this idea that all of these illuminated texts, like what were we like before this, and that this could be part of this cultural reset where we're getting the Voynich Chronicles, right? It's one of the illuminated
manuscripts. Yeah, Voynich manuscript or something.
Voynich, yeah. That one is, they say they get it. But 868 is also, when you think about it, when, according to our normal history, they say Tarmac was defeated and the Mayan Empire took over Tartaria, and that's a fun date too. So 868 is an interesting time, and when so much. I think it's also when the Glogolithic script starts, right? Because that's the period of the Cyprus monks and. They began working on that, say 900, it's like 868.
And one thing I've been amazed by is there's some ancient Chinese scrolls that have very little writing, and it's much like the website I did a while back where it's just one insanely long image. Typically it's a landscape. There's a lot of ones with festivals, and like you could literally, if you scanned at a reasonable pace, it would take you almost an hour to like just witness the entire landscape of festival activities that have been painstakingly illustrated, commissioned by some emperor.
Well, it's a trip, like when they did the Voynich, I can't even say it right, manuscript tests, and they saw the kind of materials they used to make these illuminated manuscripts, because there's gold, there's emerald, there's jade, there's ruby. They're breaking down really valuable materials to paint with and put
That's why they called them illuminated, probably because gold leaf creates real light.
Pretty sweet books.
Wow, that's amazing. And then at some point, the bookbinding becomes a thing.
Before we do bookbinding really quickly, I would also comment on China being, a place that had 300 or 400 languages that were destroyed by Emperor Xin, right? And that's that whole, we talked about it for a second, Sam and I, about the movie Hero, and that where it's all about the king trying to get rid of every other Chinese language except for the one that they're making. And so many different versions of Chinese script are so, drastically different than others because they're full on different cultures. They're pretty interesting. But yeah, bookbinding.
Absolutely.
We've forgotten.
I also wrote the word propaganda here because I think this is maybe where we begin to see written language being used for propaganda.
Havelock talks about that. He says that with the advent of mythologies, written mythologies particularly, we see the second reset, and I kind of am starting to imagine it in sort of an oriented number of resets. That every reset we upgrade humanity slightly. Like they take away the old generations and they reprogram us for a generation or two, maybe 70 years or something. And then they give us all new language again. And then everyone has to, it's completely forgotten everything in the reset. And then you end up, becoming a new culture for 1,000 years or something. The last one might have been when we started using these mythologies, because the first thing you have are these creation myths and the very simple kinds of cave beliefs. The second one is when we start saying, oh, the gods didn't have the answer to these riddles, and humanity the gods to answer riddles that that the gods couldn't figure out for themselves. They take care of they sweat the small stuff, and then humans can think real questions for them. Mythology.
Does it ever occur to you how artists and illustrators in our era posting to Instagram and Tumblr have nothing on some of these ancient scribes? I don't know. I know it's kind of faded, but here is a page from the Book of Kells with fractal geometry in gold leaf and hundreds of pages of it.
I know some people that post some pretty great sacred geometry. It's not that, and if you were to look for graffiti on walls back in Rome, you'd find, that's where the word graffiti comes from. And there are tons of cases of terrible art that somehow some of it even has made it all the way to today to survive. But there's the kinds of things that we're doing today are not necessarily more impressive. The most impressive things today are not necessarily more impressive than the most impressive stuff from then. And when you start to think about how much they knew, even if the book was blank, if you just handed me a 2,000 or 3,000 year old bound book that was just a journal ready to go, I would be impressed, because the way they bound books is so fascinating. Like we literally have forgotten more about bookbinding than they know so much, like in these periods of time, and how to keep things bound safely. And I don't know, if you could take a college class on bookbinding and you'll open your eyes to how crazy it really is. It's not as simple as it might sound.
Yeah. And this is long before the printing press. These are handwritten books commissioned by popes and kings, and
none of it's automated. So when you start to bind a book by hand, and you imagine you have sheepskin pages sometimes or whatever, like the way that some of these books weren't, before they were binding books. Like imagine when they came up with it, because first they were just doing scrolls. So the original books were scrolls, like a Facebook page. You just have Facebook.
Moses is feeling grumpy.
But
change his relationship status.
Pages make sense. I want to look at imagine just somebody was probably super drunk and they're like, I got it. I'm going to cut up my scroll. Like, I'm tired of having toilet paper rolls as my art. from now on, I want canvases. I want 1,000 canvases bound together. Mm-hmm. And so we're like, that's crazy. That's impossible. You couldn't do it. And then the guy's like, I'm going to get thicker pages and I'm going to hold them together. And I'm going to, even the very simplest idea, like it sounds as crazy as it might sound, like just making books, it changed everything about the way we read things. It changed, because a scroll, you just have to figure out where in the roll it is. Literally tape. So accessing information is hugely advanced by books. Not just by text, literally the idea of how a book works.
Yes. And they can be stored so much differently, and you can refer to pages much quicker. You can build a library and a curriculum, and it's almost like a fractal growth from a scroll. Even though a scroll has so much value that a book cannot ever have, the book has like this fractal quality that the scroll can never have.
Right. And scrolls are cool for like endless, I've got some interesting scrolls too, but yeah, it's not designed to just be like opened. You can do it. Like the way the Torah works is like that. And it's interesting how rabbis work with the Torah, because they have to know where parts of it are, and they have to know how far you have to pull it, but a lot of the time it's they still use shorter bits of Torah, but unless you're Orthodox, in which case you have to use the whole thing. It's really fascinating how they have to know where parts of this, like, and it's like 600 or 400-year-old piece of paper sometimes. So a lot of times it's sheepskin, but still you have to be really gentle with it, and but
Yeah, I was just thinking how most of these works were commissioned by the wealthy, the elites of the society, and in that sense, they were propaganda by their very nature, because they rarely came from a pure expression of the pauper poet or the. It was really like, just like I am
the
today.
idea that the pauper poet is more essential than the prince poet. I mean, if the prince poet writes a book in gold, I mean, it doesn't make it less valuable necessarily.
I agree. And I do the bulk of my work for commissions by necessity. So it's not like that much has changed.
This is an interesting, though, point, is you look at like the Sanskrit plays, like all the ancient Ayurvedic plays, and you've got like a narrator, and there's like a pauper who becomes the prince and everything. So those stories are presented for the public, and they exist. But fundamentally, like what language is for is you have these bred people that are just breeded. they breed people into different castes, and then they have a person who has to clean up for someone else to fight, while someone else works while this person's whole life is working on reciting and memorizing and writing and saving the script and the astronomy and the math. And so these books are essentially, they're saving the culture of some culture. For 1,000 years, India needed to do this without even having written language. So once it became written, it actually like alleviated a lot of the stress, because at least they had it recorded somewhere. But
How do you envision the sharing of scrolls and books? And, like, there's libraries that try to be as open source as possible and allow the information to be spread. And then there are Vatican basements where information is locked up for millions of or thousands of years.
Well, okay, so I think that there obviously are, I'm totally all about transparency. I want transparency of all data. I think every data point, every memory. I mean, like, when we were in Element today, I posted publicly to you, like we were Richard Stallman in the 70s on an MIT computer board. Like, I was like, here's the link to the video stream. No one else was trying to jump in our video stream, and it's fine, because it was like everyone can know what it is, and someone could have clicked that link, and that's not a big. I could have probably stopped it, but I like the transparency. I like where you can see things happening. And on one level it's a panopticon, and so I think that's the other side of it. And as I get older, I start to see that too, where it's like all data being free. That means that your individual privacy doesn't exist. I'm cool,
and it's the
huge.
It's also the abolition of intellectual property.
Well, yeah, not exactly, because intellectual property is described wrong. That's all. Like, so the thing about intellectual property is that we what are the two most famous international laws, right? Like, we live in an anarchy of countries that decide that there's no world government, really. They all see themselves as independent, really, except for
Kind of.
they share two kinds of laws. Property, right? Because property is the one where you represent your sovereign state, and so they say, I believe in property, and I believe this is my property, and I'll respect your property as long as you respect my property. Anarchy, right? Anarcho-capitalism. So property is the most important, sort of. What's the other one? There's two, like I said. The other one's piracy, right? So piracy is the most important law, more than property. Property is important mainly so you can enforce piracy laws. You want to be able to say, this person stole from me. This person is a pirate. This person didn't have the right to have property. They're pirating this property. This is literally where intellectual property comes from. Because what laws can you apply that already exist to something without creating new laws? And then you can write new laws about the law. This is how you say, well, I think the internet should be a law. That's not going to work. You have to be like, well, the internet's kind of like property. And eventually people will believe you. And so they've systematically memed this idea of intellectual property into our hubris. So we're like, yeah, of course, intellectual property. But there's obviously a difference, right? Because if you can duplicate something without entropy 1 billion times or 7 billion times or 100 billion times, it's not the same as something which can be exhausted, exploited, depleted, etc. There's a cost and a scarcity to physical property in our realm. It's not the same thing with digital property. So digital property has to be looked like intellectual property differently. But privacy still matters. If you get rid of intellectual property, you still have this idea of public property or your identity. And you might say, I don't want to share my identity. I don't want to be exploited for my information. And I don't want to be enforced to follow your way of thinking. And that's where, property becomes this idea. Well, if information is out there, I either don't want to see it or I want not to share it with other people. And that's where it becomes, some people don't want to share all information. This is where I think resets come in. And I think we have, like in the last, the Freemasons talked about Operation Discovery, right? And Operation Discovery is this idea of all information being available to the public for free. I think in 1989 to 2000, pretty much everything was at some point available. And if you knew, I think in 1989, 1991, if you had typed the right thing, 89 for sure, typed the right things onto a computer, you could find and open anything, almost probably without even a real password. If you knew how to get to it, you could get into systems, you could see what was going on. You could download every zip PDF, like crazy amounts of espionage could have been committed. It just was probably confusing to some people, and around the world, not everyone had access to computers and everything. But I think that was the point. And then by 2000, they started limiting people's exposure to some things, and now it's everything. Everything is kind of back to being funneled in ways, and so certain people are privy to certain information, have a right to know certain things. I think that the future, though, will be in a reset. Probably will start over completely, and then most information won't be available to anybody. The tragedy about that is you won't be able to learn from the old mistakes.
That's the way you see it going?
Well, not okay. So ironically, not. I don't see it going that way. I think they're failing at it a lot. But right. I mean, I'm pretty sure that they're pretty impressive. I give the elite a certain amount of admiration. I don't give everybody.
Well, you're calling them the elite, so clearly.
I think they're failing a lot, though, more than they should be, and it's suspicious. Yeah. So the fact that I'm able to do what I do and I'm always 2 or 3 steps ahead is really suspicious and conspicuous to me. Like that we're able to have the Matrix decentralized server, we're able to use PermaWeb, we're able to use Odyssey, that we're working with all these people, that's able to happen is super conspicuous, right? Like how could that be going on if they're really that good at running the show? I mean,
they're not that good, right?
It seems like they're pretty tragic at it. It seems like they're pretty terrible at it. It's pretty pathetic, really. I hate to say it like that.
But the skilled programmers of the world are unlikely to be big fans of these systems.
How many of your friends at the NSA are, you're Canadian. Well, a lot of the kids I know work for the NSA. Because if you can get a job for somebody who likes free software in the United States, you might as well take it. And the NSA loves free software and writes free software. They donate software to the public all the time. They made a thing recently to tell you if the Chinese government, if anybody was sniffing your Wi-Fi network. I mean, thanks, NSA. They really are doing things and that I would use. And the thing is, code is transparent. It's not like an app that's spying on you they release. It's like literally you can see what they wrote because you should take this and you should make this better. I mean, it is kind of like the Germans giving kids gliders before World War II to teach them to become bombers. But at the same time, the NSA kind of invoking a hacker army out of the public isn't bothering me that much. And I'm not against the idea of us working in the system necessarily, because the less of us working in the system, the worse it is. The people I know who try to make a difference making free software, and it's free as in speech, not as in beer. That's the thing. Like, I pay for free software. Like the people, I should start saying like that. The people that pay for free software work to, you buy a way out. Because if the internet was owned by Facebook, imagine the whole internet was owned by Facebook, right? like you'd either build another internet that somebody else owned, or a bunch of people would work together to create some sort of a highway system like the internet, with a series of tubes that everyone could access. So it's just a natural phenomenon that there would be harmonized universal standardization for a lot of the what we use, and I think we're going to work towards that. And but yeah, I do think that some of it shows. I mean, isn't every generation kind of in its own way a slight reset? Like how many old people, like how old are you? And you see your kids that don't know something you knew from the year 2001 or 2, and you're like, man, you don't remember 2002? And then you're like, wow, I'm old.
Yeah, I tell them that Spotify has nothing on Napster, and they look at me like I'm I'm talking about World War II or something.
1,000 years old, and you are talking about the Second World War in a way. It was the digital property rights war. It was the real.
Okay, let's backtrack. I want to backtrack. I want to talk about what libraries in the ancient world were in fact open source, if there were any. Were there any that would accept the paupers, like come one, come all, read the books?
So the best example of that is the Library of Alexandria, because it was a den of, people were burning poo to keep warm at one point. The Library of Alexandria was so huge that it was so old that at some point it just wasn't. And libraries get dingy, right? So if you've got mold and it's wet, and it's cold. So libraries actually get to be pretty bad after a while. They're not meant to last thousands of years. That's the other thing. I mean, I've been to a couple melted looking libraries in the Czech Republic that I think the Dungeons and Dragons movie, or one of these movies they shot at this library, it was just this crazy spiral staircase full of these giant and tiny books everywhere that were just like bent and melting like candles in the heat. But libraries, like even in Ohio, like after the influenza and stuff, they would tear out a lot of old book libraries. So there's a lot of tragedy to watching libraries go. And one of the ones that was taken was the Library of Alexandria. And that's where Hypatia worked. And Hypatia was, the sexiest woman of all time, probably. She was an astronomer, a mathematician, algebraist, a calculus teacher, a philosopher, a philosophy teacher. And she was, super cool. But she ran the library, and the library for 1,000 years before she ran it had accumulated scrolls and books in a tax. So trade was open to Alexandria, but to get in, you'd have to bring books. And your books would be, or scrolls, and you're from your culture, and they'd have to be, and you could then, I think it was 3 was the minimum. Books back then were handwritten, so 3 books it's pretty impressive to have 3 books. And so you'd have to bring 3 books, and then they would take your books, and they would duplicate the book twice, and they would give you back 1 copy, and then they would have a duplicated copy, and they'd have the original. They'd want to keep the original. So it was really weird how Alexandria worked. And then a lot of people needed salt and beef and, women, like slaves, like you were saying earlier. So they were bringing books, and the Library of Alexandria accumulated over a period of time. They had to build new wings. It's a very, very large collection, but for the most part, they weren't books. Most of those were scrolls, and you could stack scrolls on top of each other back and forth like a Jenga pile. And you pull scrolls out of the Jenga pile, and you can then read them and put them back in. There's actually certain sticks that have recesses in them that build up. So it's not like just a perfect Jenga pile that is going to fall over all the time, but it still kind of looks like that. And there's thousands.
How do you spell the woman's name you were talking about?
Hypatia. Hypatia. And of course,
Did she have an OnlyFans account?
There's a movie with Rachel Weisz, from The Mummy, where she played Hypatia. What she did that got her killed was she described the Egyptian astronomical menstrual cycle, right? Because the Egyptians believe that the goddess has this menstrual cycle and cramps and births the earth or the sun every morning, and there's this whole ritual thing that they describe. She explained that, and they're like, she's describing the universe as her menstrual cycle. Get her, and it was this really kind of that's the narrative anyway. Historically, what they say after
you went after the first feminist.
She comes off as a feminist, but
literary feminist.
that make you hate her either. I mean, because in real life, all she was a really powerful individual, regardless of anything else. She talked about how spirit has human beings as experience. And, she was into math and science, and she just knew things other people didn't know because most people weren't privy to that information. No one's going to go to a dark, dingy library and pull out scrolls. And she's working there. So she's all day like looking through scrolls, and she's interested in what they're about. She's like, what? I have to learn a new language. There's probably a number of books that are literally just on that. So she goes and she grabs her language to Egyptian or prior schematic symbols and tries to infer what they're about, and then gets clubs together. And clubs of dudes are there, obviously, like to learn, and they're students, and their whole thing is to get around specific ideas and to infer what the books are about and what the symbols in those books are about, even if they're from a culture that's forgotten 1,000 years ago. So it would have been an exciting time to be in the Library of Alexandria in the 100 years before and during as it was burned and falling, because it actually caught fire about 100 years before it burned down. There's already some problems with it before all this. And people were getting books out before that. They were getting, lots of, I think about 60% maybe of the Library of Alexandria was saved. And the rest, page turners, they were not, I think is the story, hopefully. But like a lot of the books were lost, and it's a tragedy. It's the thing about the Library of Alexandria that everyone talks about forever. But just in terms of access, at different times in history, people had more access to books. And that was probably the thing about the 1700s and about the 19th century, like people having access to libraries in the United States. I don't know, Canada must be similar, right? Like we had crazy access to books. Like if you didn't have it at a library, you could just ask for it to be sent to the next library.
Yeah. So what's the counterexample? Can you think of like the example of the most protected and secretive literary collection?
Man, I mean, like Disney has some pretty weird stuff. Prince's personal library vault, he keeps his intellectual property. He died though, so maybe you could probably get there now. Your example of the Vatican library is not bad. The Vatican library for a long time was hyper protected, especially of things they stole from other cultures. But even that, like they've digitally put a lot of the Vatican library online, and you can get access to that. We have that a lot of it in the Foundry at Tartar Nova. Maybe like 100 gigabytes of books from the Jesuits. But I mean, what would you say is the most? I mean,
what about the Masons?
So the Masons, they put out their stuff. So you've got the Morals and Dogma, like that's been out since the 1800s. And a lot of Masons are self-made. They don't even join a lodge to become a Mason. You can become a Mason by becoming a Mason at sight. Albert Pike was supposedly a Mason at sight, who someone opened a lodge for a day just to get him, and they created one out of because they were a Mason. And they're like, okay, let's just get this done with because you're an honorary. So Masons are open to data transfers. They're Protestants, a lot of them. So
you're starting to make me like them.
You can't hate everybody. Hate. As I heard a guy says he hates Enya. Like there's not a lot of room in your diet for hate. You know what I mean? Like
I don't hate the Masons. I just have extreme distrust for high level Masons.
Don't have trust for people you don't need to. Don't have unnecessary trust. And having distrust, act proactively is also an energetical waste. But it's good to do. Also, you should probably do that. That's fine. But no, they're not the most secret group in the world. Actually, I think the most.
What role does sigils play in this, and how does that connect to Jesuits?
Well, okay, so sigils and talismans have a lot to do with Medea, the witch, and so she's from Italy or from Medes in Mediterranean area. She might even have been Croatian. I digress. Croatians often have really interesting characters like Marco Polo. Marco Polo is Croatian, but the Italians take credit for it. It's a thing. So Medusa, she had the snake-like hair. Sometimes has been accredited with being Medea. I'm not convinced. I'm more convinced it's the Oracle of Delphi. But like looking at Medea, her whole deal was she made magical talismans for people, and sigils will be breaking down a symbol that the artist understands. So you might take
your name, get rid of the vowels, combine the symbols, the letters together to make a weird new letter, and then that letter might be attached to a trophy or a star or a win, WN for win or something like that. So people will make logos that they can break down and understand using, I think Gurdjieff talks about this a lot, is symbolic logic. Or, well, everybody does now because of natural language processing in computers. But you make a sigil, and then your mind, because it's trying to understand the symbol, constantly is like, oh, I know what that is. That's weird. What is that weird thing? That weird thing means this. And just by constantly doing that, it's the what's that called? The secret box branding. There's like a kind of a secret branding that happens. Companies that hide their brand, or they make it hard to figure out
subliminal advertising.
Yeah, so like if you watch like sitcoms from the year 2001 until recently, at least, they'll drink drinks that have brand names that look like in the same writing as Coca-Cola, but they say like soda pop or something, or Smolda Lola or whatever, and they'll have like 7 Up. It'll be like Up 9 or L or something. It'll always be flipped around in a weird way, but your brain is like, what is that? That's not anything I know. And then it's like, oh, I know what that is. That looks like Coca-Cola. And then that's the best advertisement ever, because your mind doesn't, you just see a Coca-Cola, you might not register it, it's whatever. How many times have you noticed that the Terminator movie is all about Pepsi? Like, it's not really the big, there's great amounts of scenes where he's getting shot in front of a Pepsi machine. Like, it's more valuable for someone to be like, what does that machine say? Oh, it says Smepsi. Oh, because it's like Pepsi. Oh, Pepsi. And then your brain creates a registry. That's how sigil magic works, and even just marketing pathology.
Do you also think about how sigil magic works in terms of ritual, or like I think about tattoos, and like if you place a tattoo in a certain part for a certain meaning, it really does take on a magical form?
Yeah, man, I try to advise people to like be real careful about doing a blood ritual. When everyone says, I'm going to get a tattoo, I'm like, what are you getting with who? And they're like, I don't know. I'm just going to go meet some random tattoo artist and have something on a wall put on my body forever. I'm just like, you probably should have read Solomon's Seal.
Solomon's Seal?
Right. So any of these stories like Faust, where he goes to the railroad crossing and he, sells his soul, they have to do a Solomon's Seal. And so Solomon has the lesser keys and the greater keys of Solomon's Goetia and their Goetia. And then those symbols, he has a seal. Solomon has a seal. And then you can trap a demon in a sigil, or an energy, or a personality, or that's another interesting thing with this idea of these symbols, right? So you can trap the same idea, and you can invoke the same. Imagine you walk away from a drawing and someone comes to it, like there's like an episode, I think there's a Chipmunks movie, right, where they show up in the rainforest, and then Simon can read what this ancient sacrifice of Theodore is going to be about. Because he can read, he's like, oh, wow, yeah, it's written this way. And oh, man, this must mean this. This symbol could mean that. Imagine being able to train, like 1,000 years later, it's like kind of like having a tape player, because you can then get the sounds or the symbols or the meanings out. So sigils are pretty trippy, and sounds themselves it might be literally that you hear the sound. So like Krishna, like Hare Krishna is impressive that they've gotten people to say it so many times over all throughout history. But looking at a symbol and it having the same register, the same feeling or idea or realization, that's different than sounds. Sounds are not always onomatopoeias, but an eye in a triangle is probably going to mean a lot of the same. And that's why corporations' logos are almost always a sigil instead of their name written out. And even if it is written out, like Coca-Cola, like is written out in this magical satanic sigilling, Oh,
satanic. How so satanic?
I mean, it's not fair to say that, but it just had. I'm sorry I said that, but like looking at this swirling, it has this kind of arabesque red and white swirling that just it comes off as to me as just a little
so a bit lustful.
It's a little magical in an interesting way. I mean, just one quick
curvaceous.
Yeah, I mean that's the sexualization of it, and it's associated with drugs, and it was made by a foundling Civil War soldier who was addicted to morphine and cocaine, and like I mean, there's a lot of weird stuff with the South American Sol Negro and Coca-Cola bottling their water control with Nestle. I mean, Coca-Cola is an interesting company. Like it is.
Mm-hmm.
And
Okay,
the fact
so
that their symbol is not a normal triangle like
Yeah.
everybody else.
So when I see this triangle, especially when I think of it on the US dollar, what I think the break between the trapezoid and the top of the pyramid represents is the issuing power of money, and that there's a class represented by the triangle that is above that issuing power of money. These are the people who actually own the private central banks. And then there's a totally different class below it. That's how I interpret that symbolism. Is that also how you kind of interpret it?
You see me on with Sam Tripoli on my show, talking about the trapezoid, my whole thing for trapezoid. So I would say I'd elaborate a little bit deeper by saying that it's not just the money making machine; it's a flying saucer, this eye that's floating over a trapezoidal sacrificial altar. So you've got this altar that are climbing on top of each other to get to the top of the altar, where they're smashed probably by the eye, the all-seeing eye that comes down on them, and they're thrown from the top down to the very, very bottom. The tallest point also is less steep; it's more narrow. Right at the base of it, it seems like you can climb up, but at a certain point, the highest point is the closest to falling down. And Euclid refers to the trapezoid a lot as a little table. So there's a lot to call it the altar. I think it is an altar for sacrifice.
That's interesting. I never thought of it as an altar. That's creepy, but makes sense.
Right. Another group that would consider it an altar would be Michael Aquino's Temple of Set, because they have a thing, I think it's called, let me see, the Order of the Trapezoid. Does that exist anymore? Yeah, go to trapezoid.org and you'll find, oh, nice creepy page right there. I almost don't want to show you, but I'll do it anyway because it doesn't have any sound. So check this out. Trapezoid.org, the Order of the Trapezoid. The Order of the Trapezoid is a chivalric order of knighthood dedicated to the Prince of Darkness and the protection of the Black Flame. There's a song about the Prince of Darkness, Someday My Prince Will Come, from Snow White, if you remember, in the Seven Dwarfs. The order was first formally introduced by Anton LaVey in December 1970, issue of the Church of Satanic newsletter, The Cloven Hoof.
All right, stop propagating the sigils of the dark world.
I gotta finish the point. This is like the Freemasons square group of the Temple of Set. This is not okay. You got the Order of Set. You've got the Church of Satan. This is their more bougie square. You got dudes in the military that run this thing, created by Jekyll. Look at this. All right. Okay. So like when you start to look into the military, the NSA, and the Church of Satan, it is important, and their interest in symbolism is like pretty pervasive. All right.
Okay, we haven't talked about the mathematics of the geometry yet. Of course, the golden ratio is the first thing that appears. I kind of want to draw it back. You talked about the Disney library, and then I also think about just like the wealth of knowledge that the early Disney animators and writers were like. You really like posting that one about Donald Duck and the Pythagoreans.
Right, Donald Duck in Math Magic Land. It's pretty sweet. Have you seen that there's a movie?
Tell me about the library.
Well, so there's a movie that John Malkovich just made called 100 Years. And the film was shot secretly with Robert Rodriguez and buried for 100 years a time vault. So nobody gets to watch this film for 100 years. It'll come out in 2115.
That's hilarious.
And this is not the only
Watch
time.
that shit leak, though.
This happens a lot, all right? And if you start to look at Bohemian Grove plays, a lot of the time they'll publish a Bohemian Grove play, and then it'll become a movie in 100 years. It's one of the things, like, it's pretty. They do have a secret library.
Vaulted? Would you say that that's like a vaulted?
Well, Disney called it Vault Disney, right? That's what they have, is they have Vault Disney. And so they've released a couple things here and there from Vault Disney. They'll be like, here's a really remarkably suspicious, conspicuously good recording of an aerial recording theoretically nobody should have from 1955 of Disneyland opening. Boom. And we're like, here's an amazing recording. We have Disney during black and white television era they filmed Zorro in color. No one could see it in color, but they filmed it in color. And then because Disney thought eventually he'd release it from the vault, and indeed they did. And, you know, they make money off it with their Disney Plus and everything else. So some things are there, some things aren't there. Flubber, The Absent-Minded Professor, the sequel is not out on Disney Plus for whatever reason. The 1960 movie. It's probably more about his anti-government and weather control stuff, but still, I digress. There are points where Disney hides data, and the Scientologists come up in this as well. The Scientologists have a vault. The CIA have a vault. I mean, classifying data for 20 years, 40 years, 70 years is very common. But with a corporate copyright, if it's completely forgotten, then once it becomes public domain, you know, nobody knows about it because it's been forgotten. So that's another thing. They do this more. The military contract companies will copyright something and then they'll forget about it on purpose. They'll shred the data within a 5-year plan, not a 40 or 70-year plan, you know. So Scientology has a lot of crazy stuff, and their secrets are pretty good. Clambake is probably only 10%, you know, of what they have. And if you think Scientology is just a huge joke, it's not. And if you think that it's just a money-making scheme, well, it's not just a money-making scheme. It's also like a mind control experiment, but there's a lot of things about it that are really useful for real, like a very valuable technology. Like I would call it a technology. So, I mean, those kinds of things are hidden from the public too.
Okay, let's talk about the printing press.
Where do you want to start? In the 1550?
Yeah. Would you say 1550? Is that when?
1515.
1515. Okay.
Is that right? Is that right? Let me check.
Sure. I don't. You would know more than me, that's for sure.
I feel like 1516 or something like that. Printing press. Let me see. Printing press. China, obviously, but 1440. Goldsmith Johannes Gutenberg invents the printing press. 1440. What am I thinking?
And it's probably not in industrial use for another decade or two.
Right. Let me see. What am I comparing it to? Oh, okay. 1515 has to do with the dancing plague, which is one of the first times where they're able to send press back and forth to each other, which we can talk about too. But so if you look at ancient China has a printing press, and if you look at the Sumerians, the scrolls are designed to be rolled, so they're written backwards in order to be mirrored onto a page. They paint the page and they roll, or they paint the script and the scroll and they roll it across the page.
Right. If you go back to my screen for a second, I have an image here of a stamp that was for, I think, a William Blake book, where you can see, I don't know, maybe I need to clarify it, but yeah, it's reversed. It was, you know, we're talking about a hand carved stamp that's been carved in reverse.
Annie Queenie says the computer wore tennis shoes. I love that movie, and I kind of feel like that movie sometimes. There are moments where in that movie, like, he loses the computer, like electricity, and he's like, I feel like that sometimes. Not right this second.
And then we also I'm curious where map making comes into the history of scribbling.
Well, John Dee and Mercator were buddies, and they were really into making both maps of our reality and of other realms, which I think is interesting. Someone who's a map maker just would like to make maps. So they would make maps for places they didn't have data for. Sounds a lot like doodles and scribbles to me, you know? But they also, John Dee would convince people, like, you're actually mapping your remote viewing, man. And, like, you know, who's to say they weren't? And a lot of the time they probably kind of were in some degree. I mean, we see today the government paying tons of money for people to remote view, and to remote viewing cartography is like it's a booming business if you're looking for a niche.
Remote viewing cartography. Who commissions these works?
How you can get through Antarctica? The problem is dolphins are better at it than you. But it's like dolphins are better at it than anybody. So because they can do echolocation in a chamber. One of those sensory deprivation circumstances, like a dolphin can figure it out better than you.
And so this printing press leads to what we call pamphleteering, which is like actually, in my opinion, one of the most important things that people don't talk about much, which is like it was the original social media. You want to spread a meme, you print a pamphlet and you distribute it to your neighbors.
I was going to say another interesting thing is when you look at where Gutenberg is from and the whole story, because it's super sketch, right? Because obviously printing presses existed before him, but he brought he invented it. He might have not even really invented it. He might have like straight up just taken something from China. And
totally,
he's from like a Rhineland, well, from the Byzantine or Turkey too, because like the Chinese, the Tartar Chitao Chinese had printing presses, and Byzantine essentially was starting to have these duplication machines. He could have easily had this brought to the Rhineland, and the symbol for Mainz or Mons, or I don't know how you say it, Mainz, I think you call it Mainz. Is a two wheels, tied together in a cross. I'll stop for a second. That's where the flag from where he's from where Gutenberg's from. So there's some weird stuff about tech, from where he's at. A transport hub. He's from even Wikipedia refers to it as a major transport hub.
Right. So. Yeah, that's what I gathered too. Like the printing press is pretty intuitive. Like you said, they existed in quote unquote China before he brought them to Europe.
Right. And what even is China, but like Uyghur, Tartaria, Manchuria,
Right. It's like, the first central banks show up there before they show up in Europe too, but people don't talk about that much.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing too, because it kind of suggests that there was more of a reset in Europe than there was in China. Because until the 20th century, when they full on just destroy China, like they kill 100 million Manchurians, and then they completely create a new China with the communist state that burns all the violins and books and starts even a new language, right? New simplified script, a new script, so that you can't read the old Chinese. Like up until their reset, China probably was less reset in the 1500s. So when Marco Polo was talking, or that at least in that idea of that period, that ideal period, China probably did still have things that they didn't realize were so valuable, like this banking credit system or smart contracts. I don't know if smart's the word, but they were contracts that were systemized and better than what the Scandinavians seem to be using.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think about pamphleteering? What does that bring up for you?
Well, that is the beginning of information spreading without lodges. Most of the dudes spreading information are members of lodges. So you got Freemasons like Ben Franklin and Thomas Paine, and but even Luther is a Protestant, he's a Catholic. He becomes the first Protestant, and so there's a lot of it are they're like the Freemasons. A lot of them started out as priests, and then they started having altar boys who never became priests because of this 17th century excommunication. So the Protestants' interaction after Luther is a justification for information spreading. So these academics, I guess you could say, during a time when not everyone were academics, were spreading information with pamphlets, and the more they could get people educated enough to read them, comics are really useful. You look at the Gangs of New York and Boss Tweed, and most of the time, what really takes someone apart are the comics and the pictures. Like if you see a picture of a skinny group of people and a big fat version of your local mayor, and he's so fat his clothes don't fit, and he's eating and you're skinny, it's pretty clear what they're saying, and it's the inferences can make someone lose an election. But you make him ugly, big nose, drunk looking, etc. But
caricature.
Thomas Paine is able to really get people to think about anti-disestablishmentarianism. I find the most useful thing that happened in the 1700s with Thomas Paine wasn't even that he inspired the American Revolution. It's more that he convinced the British that it was an okay thing, because he wrote an anti-disestablishmentarianism pamphlet, which was circulated around Parliament, and it said, let the Americans have it, because it's so much work. And let them do it. If they're going to do the work, it's a lot of work. Let them do all the work. You know what? And then what we'll do, we'll buy stuff from them cheap. We'll treat them like India. Who cares, really? And that works. It was more valuable than shooting ceramics out of muskets at the troops, was just to get the British to say, yeah, wait, why are we trying to like pay our own people to run this madhouse of Americans? Let the colonies just sort of, and the thing is, they're going to try harder to justify their actions. They're going to be, oh, I'm the most British judge there is. I'm going to be such a great government. I'll be the British, let them try. And so that actually was pretty powerful. I think that pamphleteering is the most powerful thing. Having said that, look at Mao's Little Red Book and look at what happens when you can control people's ideology with pamphlets. It can be also a weapon, but it is, of course it can be, because it's that powerful.
Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of being led to like early. Here I have a comic by Winsor McCay where he has Father Knickerbocker saying that he's so proud of his tall buildings.
Winsor McCay, he's the guy who did Finding Nemo, right? Or
Little Nemo, yeah. Little Nemo and Slumberland. And he was hired by William Randolph Hearst, who was his central employer, to do these political cartoons. And his political cartoons are amazing. Here's one of them, this technocracy one. And I mean, I'm guessing this is in the 20s, maybe early 30s. And he has so many of these. If you just look up Winsor McCay political cartoons, you get a lot of really effective, semi-propagandist. And then he really got on William Randolph Hearst's bad side because he was far more interested in the invention of animation and exploring that and touring with that than he was in doing this sort of propaganda for mainstream newspapers.
I forget the whole story, but there's some connection to him to Santa Cruz too. I know he's born in Michigan and dies like somewhere else, but
he was also a high-level Mason.
Right. Yeah, he's connected with. Yeah, I mean, Gertie the dinosaur was the other weird thing he did.
There's literally he's literally the godfather of animation. He created it basically. To him, it was a craft, and then he got to see it go from his little craft to a real industry. And to him, that was sad because he saw how much love and character could go into it, and then how much of that evaporates once you do it in the factory assembly line style, like Disney and Fleischer started doing. But it is amazing. Like, we're talking about people, we see the beginnings of animation all the way back into the cave drawings. But then when it really comes alive in Winsor McCay's time, then we're talking about people who can actually sit and look at a screen and see characters come to life. And there were people who shrieked at Gertie the dinosaur. There were people who freaked the fuck out.
I'm sure,
who ran out of the vaudeville theaters because they couldn't believe this giant two-dimensional cartoon was interacting in this way.
They were probably an absinthe as well.
For sure. And then at the same time, we see the typewriter become a very popular household item. So people are...
to point out before we did the typewriter that in Uber memes, we had some pretty cool stuff posted. What was it? I was just going to pull up and then I went too far past it, I think. Was it balkanized? I'll come back to it. All right, go back to typewriter. We'll do that later. Point is, this is great getting the Uber memes, guys, because this is kind of like scribbling and pamphleteering.
It is. I mean, it's this where it's like a communal scroll. It's almost like what they would have in the Library of Alexandria. They would have sat around a table, probably scribbling on one central scroll.
I want to say one thing also real quickly. When I was young and I was still trying to make movies in Hollywood, I met this lady and I asked, she's like, "What are you doing? What are you going to make? And what are you going to do?" And so I was like, "I want to make movies." And she's like, "Oh, well, that's weird." And I don't know how she said it, but I was like, "What do you mean? Like, what do you mean it's not like what?" It's like, "Oh, because I think it said something like I wanted to say something that touched people or something, like kind of change the lives of people in the movies." And she's like, "Well, those are because a movie, you can only hit so many people because they have to walk into the movie theater and watch the Gertie, to run out of the vaudeville theater. Like they have to be like really into being in that theater in the first place. But, a movie's only going to hit people that are in that building that have that wall that's been surrounded closed. And so it's interesting that the thing I ended up doing more than make movies, I mean, I've done some, but memes, right? Like memes and pamphleteering have hit so many people, blindsided so many people who were just minding their own business, trying not to get in any trouble, and then all of a sudden they saw something that we made, you know.
Yeah.
Meme, as they say in Latin America. All right, go on to the typewriter, because I have to talk about Soviet typewriter propaganda after that. So
I'm not sure if I have anything specific to say about the typewriter, except that once it started to become a household item, I'm sure it was within the richest houses for the first decade, and then became more and more common after that. But it allowed people to write each other letters that looked very official and create contracts and legislation that looked very official from the comfort of their own home. Xirtus, did I lose you, buddy? Your video has disappeared and you seem to be muted. I have made you disappear with my mind. Okay, I guess I run the show now. Let's draw Xirtus. He's got a funny chin like this, right? And then, I don't know what his nose looks like. He's got these squinty little eyes. And he's always kind of like smirking.
aw.
Hey, buddy.
Like a hero chin. I like it. Like the Moon Man.
I did some decent ones in my sketchbook of your weird face.
Dude,
while
I
I
was
was
trying you did one art of me that looked so much like it was like a Viennese artist. I was trying to remember, like,
Oh, I remember you told me it looked like Escher and what's the other artist's name? Egon Schiele.
Egon Schiele. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I don't know if you still have that drawing. I remember being very proud of it at the time.
Totally have that.
I was like, I nailed this motherfucker.
Yeah, that was great. That's pretty crazy.
You should send it to me and I'll put it in the scroll, and when I update it, it'll all be there.
All right.
What I was going to say about the typewriter is that it created a paradigm where people would write contracts and legislation from the comfort of their own home, and it completely lost the signature of their own writing style and became a uniform stamp.
So my dad really wanted to get a Russian typewriter when he was in the Cold War era, you know, and like he couldn't get one very easily because to buy a typewriter required a license, like a car.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, you could use it for information. Information is a weapon, and you had to make sure that the people who had the typewriters were the right people. So
wow, I never heard that. That's cool.
Difficult to get. So what they do have is a thing called samizdat, and samizdat kind of translates to like counterfeit or self-publishing. So self-publishing, but self-publishing was for a lot of the time you would get, I mean, samizdat is pretty varied. So first off, not everyone had a typewriter, and so figuring out ways of copying papers was really fascinating. And then how you hand type a book and put it together. Like here's a hand printed book that they figured out ways of doing. Some people would do this by hand. They would type out a whole book. Some of this stuff is like that. Pretty beautiful.
Wow.
And kind of paper that they use. This is obviously made of, like, look at that paper. Even just that's super nice kind of handmade paper, unbleached papers. They're lightly bleached papers, but they would do this for music too. So like you could get a vinyl record. I wonder if they have that here somewhere. samizdat vinyl. So, or I could type X-ray. It might be the right way to do it. Okay, here's an example. So they would take X-rays, and the X-ray you could take on a record player, because we couldn't get vinyl. They could record onto the X-ray a music, and so people were taking lung pictures, brain pictures, all these X-ray scans, and then they'd bring home the data and they'd cut it, and then they would put that on a record, and they would they'd scratch into it the music. So this is how they would save, information on music that was otherwise, locked from anybody using. But
So samizdat means like self-published or amateur published.
right, yeah, self-published, or you could also say counterfeit in a sense, because it means not created by the authority. Yeah, and it's
not authored by the authority.
Same problem with corporations. Corporations think they're the authority to produce art, right? Mm-hmm. And so you have self-published stories, like I think you call them fan fiction, you could say, and that also exists in a sense, should be legally considered samizdat. It's a self-published work that doesn't follow the authority, but back then a lot of it was literally just to duplicate things. What's fascinating though is you meet like a blind Polish musician today from in his 60s. He can the music, the further east you go, like it becomes copies of maybe someone had a vinyl of their lung picture, and then the next person had a tape recorder next to the speaker, and so you're hearing, by the time it gets to like East Kazakhstan, you're hearing some weird abstract stuff. It wasn't the original Sonny and Cher or Elton John recording. And by the time you hear the Russian punk music scene, they've taken it and they've created something new with it, in the same way that shortwave radio from the Bayou reached Jamaica and made reggae. And reggae is a response to the bouncing of shortwave on the water. But yeah, samizdat, pretty interesting stuff. There's a lot of really great books that are that were published on toilet paper that way, basically, out of gulags. Wow. Like the Master and the Margarita.
So as I continue the scroll, the direction my mind was going was more into what happens between the interchange between images and text in the form of comics, comic strips, graphic novels. And then before I hit that, we have to rewind all the way back to here a little bit and talk about directionality in writing. Because these comic strips follow logically from top left, right, and then down row by row, but not all languages are like that. The Japanese do it sort of in an inverse way.
Right to left is pretty, I almost always look bottom right first. I don't know why.
Really?
Yeah. I was trying to see what's going on at the bottom right of a thing.
Is it because you want to jump to the end, or is it just because it actually does feel like the beginning to you?
It feels like the beginning, / also I look at the fine print and I'm like, well, all that stuff is just, to make you feel comfortable. I just want to know what's really going on. It's going to be there.
Because even our symbol for a play button is very like assumptive that we're going left to right. To go forward is to go right.
Twilight says I was muted. Was I just now when I said that, or no? Could you hear me?
No, I heard you.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I was just talking about the play button and how that infers a left to right process of narrative. You know what I mean?
I think that the more that we look at things left to right all the time, okay, it changes everything, right? In film, it's a big thing. If you look at, there's a Canon Films, the original Snow Cone, I think it's called, or Yellow Snow Cone, or something. So it's a coming of age story about Israeli boys, and they remade the movie in America. Israelis read Hebrew, which is right to left. The screen, when they filmed the movie, they filmed the entire movie inverse. So when they walked stage right, now they walk in stage left, screen left. Because if you have an audience looking for someone, it feels unbalanced, and this is European movies, often they'll do this because the car will be on the other side, and it just feels weird. And so now they put the character in the center of the screen more. but there's like a kind of a weight that you feel to things starting where you start. So movies will do that. I think that when you have a language and you have order of operations, that also seems, if you're doing this because you want your priests to read, they're going to follow a protocol. But if you're making this more for people to infer in the future, then that's another reason why they do things vertically. So that it just comes to you can follow the scroll and it seems more logical.
I see. This is a big tangent, but I watched that video you made with you reading The Last President.
Oh, that was really my robot reading it. I wasn't really there.
That occurred to me after I had already watched quite a bit of it.
On a trip.
That this was actually like algorithmic, and that was amazing. That like blew my mind even more. And then there's the suspended train in Germany.
That's the thing. So some of that
I didn't know that existed, and I showed it to somebody, and she was like, "That is not real." And I said, "What do you think it's CGI?" And she said, "Well, she was just at a loss." And I looked at it.
There is some cleaning up of the footage, right? And so
it's algorithmically colored.
Yeah, there's stuff going on there, and I link you to the guy who's doing some of the greatest research. At the beginning of that video, you can see some of the research he's doing with neural trainers. And there are things where, let's say horses are walking, you can pull up footage of other horses, and the algorithm can neurally train itself to infer the scratches as pictures of other pixels from other horses and fix the old footage. So there are things like that where they're putting new people's faces into old movies and things like that. But in terms of, is that train real? Of course it is, because it's still there today. And we actually have footage of that train right now, basically. It still operates. The problem is it doesn't seem nearly as miraculous anymore, because it looks like downtown Brooklyn and, a slum of Germany where, it's not like it was then, when it was just beautiful to ride around. And rural,
that must have been a trip. Taking that train in like 1910 must have been amazing.
Well, that's the thing. It's also a trip when you start to look at all these places. That's one of the other aspects of Tartaria, is like by looking into resets or into our whole, alternative timeline thing, we're also looking into just what the official narrative is. And it's pretty crazy. Like, Minneapolis apparently had electric trolley systems before anyone had electric trolley systems. And they had, so you see these castles that look like the 18th century Bavarian castles in Minneapolis. And you have giant electric systems. So, 120 years ago, New Orleans was lit. 120 years ago, parts of Italy were they still had electricity even in the 11th century in Cordoba. So it's beyond, most people can't fathom this reality outside of just having an iPhone. They don't understand what it could be like that we had all this great stuff. But that
were talking to, sorry, go on.
Oh, sorry.
No, you finish your thought first.
You see that train there is an erector set. Most of those pieces are pieces that modular can fit together. So when you start to think about what mass scale they had of enlarged versions of things that they were modeling in the 1700s and 1800s, they'd already had all of these ideas and they were scaling up. So we did have actually like better infrastructure then than often we do now by a long shot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so easy to destroy infrastructure that we forget how amazing it has been. We forget about the Antikytherian device, and we forget. You were talking to Tripoli about sort of an ancient form of Morse code using like pendulums.
Oh, right. Okay, the pentelograph, pentelogram machine, pentelogram. I'll pull that up. This is funny because when I was on Adam's show, I mentioned it near the end, and he couldn't find it. I think he just pentelograph. Let's put that, see if that pulls up. There you go, pentelograph. Pentelogram won't come up, but pentelograph will. Well, what do you think you're going to send with a pentelograph machine, man? So a pentelogram was a note sent through a facsimile machine, transmitted over normal telegraph lines, invented by developed is even nice that Wikipedia did this. Giovanni Caselli. Commercially,
I saw the year 1906.
Say what?
I saw the year 1906. Is that what we're talking about?
No, this is 1860s. Let's go back.
1860s. Okay.
used commercially in the 1860s, right there. Used
Okay.
commercially in the 1860s. Okay. 1860s. Okay. And it has kind of similar features to the telegraph machine, but it, here's like a telegraph wire connected to a pendulum, and the pendulum's moving back and forth, and I can zoom in a little bit for you there to make that clearer. Here's some, actually, what are this? Batteries connected up to this box, which is receiving the signal, and then it's actually transmitting. So that's an interesting machine. And so then it's sending the electrical signal down to these magnets, and the magnets are pushing the pendulum back and forth, and then that causes this to write. And I remember seeing this at the Tech Museum when I was a kid too. So they know about this stuff, but they make it sound like, this was available in the 1860s and we moved on. Here's a really large example of this pentelograph machine, right?
So do you think they existed way before the 1860s? Is that kind of what you're proposing?
I think that's the point of the Library of Alexandria lessons that we have, is that if you look at all the stuff that they were putting together in the 1860s, it was stuff that they had accumulated from probably the 1600s, after the Porter. There's a great book called How the Irish Saved Civilization. And it's all about the idea that Irish were able to port books from the Byzantine, which became the Renaissance books. Like the Renaissance was kind of when they were taking Byzantine books in old medieval post-Rome, post-collapse Rome, between Byzantine Roman Empire books, and they were, sold off to the people who had libraries because they were porters and they needed something to do. They kept these books. And those books ended up being, inspirational to neoclassicalism and also to the technology in the 1700s, Ben Franklin and all the people studying the Moorish sciences. So why are they calling it the Moorish sciences? Because this stuff was super rampant common in the Islamic Empire. And that's one of the reasons I went to Cordoba, Spain, right? Because Cordoba, Spain is where they have the, Maimonides was there. It was a Muslim Spanish utopia. Like everybody was, it's nice now. Like everything about it's great. I mean, it had water running through the stones and trees were growing in the city. So it's just this perfect Epcot from 1,000 years ago, experimental prototype Disney World town, but it's 1,000 years ago. And, it's perfect, but it also had electricity from spinning water wheels, which is, that's basically the argument. Did or did they not have electricity from water 1,000 years ago? Well, yeah, they did. So.
Wow. I was talking to Ben Stewart, and he was telling me that there's I think it's an ancient Hebrew scroll that describes something remarkably similar to an atomic bomb. A perpendicular explosion that incinerated bodies for miles. The only refuge was to dive deep underwater to save yourself from the blast, holding your breath for minutes underwater. I don't remember the exact, but that was kind of the description that was laid out.
That sounds like the Vedic text the Indians have in terms of manas and the Hindu flying machines. They talk about nuclear sized explosions that kill thousands of people or just destroy worlds. Hence Oppenheimer saying, "I've become death destroyer, Shiva, death destroyer of worlds. I've become God, destroyer of worlds." It's because of the Vimanas. These are
right.
They look like black bells or yellow bells. They have two pillars, or you could consider them rocket fuselages. And there's the German guy who talks about it. But this idea that Vimanas are the nukes, I don't think they are the nukes exactly. That's a thing, but they might actually have nukes inside them. That's the point that they're making, is that the nuclear technology is in there.
And Ben was saying that one of the people, I don't know, I don't think it was Oppenheimer, but somebody involved with the first nuclear blast was asked, how does it feel to be responsible for the world's first atomic bomb? And he said, it's not the world's first atomic bomb, just the first in modern history.
Right, exactly. I mean, this is the thing. What their excuse against that is they'll say that us scientists are crazy guys, and that's totally fair. I mean,
he was just being crazy.
Yeah, he's into Hindu astrology because he likes math. That's my problem, right? But no, I think that there's plenty of evidence that they're pointing to. That's why we continue to search. We look at what the Freemasons say is that they got everything from Atlantis and Tartaria. It's like in their books. and Oppenheimer was clearly interested in the. You look at it earlier. We talked about in the matrix system that we've got the in the books section. We have the new Library of Ages section, which is like the Tartaria literature section we had before in the Discord. Tons of books. I think it's better organized than it was before right now. And it's got the scientist of Tartary. A scientist. I think it's a scientist visits Tartary, or a scientist in Tartary, something like that. And so it's a pretty fascinating book. There's tons of books about Tartary, but these are all different people's accounts. And this guy's a scientist from the 1500s, 1600s, and he's talking about all the different mechanical marvels that Tartaria has. And I mean, it'd be really unlikely to me that we were the first civilization to reach a lot of these goals. I think we're far too proud of ourselves in that way.
Yeah, I agree. I was just thinking about, so the last couple images I have on here, one is Dr. Seuss, because I just think he's unmatched in a way that I can't even describe as a cartoonist and as a book writer. And then the other one I have is Bill Watterson, who is also unmatched in this own way. And I believe this is the last strip that he ever published of Calvin and Hobbes. And this panel here, I love, because he's talking about the beauty of a fresh snow, and he says it's like having a big white sheet of paper to draw on, a day full of possibilities. And this makes me think, like, I share this feeling when I open a sketchbook to a blank page. There's a tingle in my soul seeing all that white paper and know I'm about to like use it as a manifestation tool. And there's like a bittersweetness of drawing on a blank piece of paper. And the word manifest, I think, is drawn back to shipping. And if you were carrying cargo on a ship, you would arrive with the manifest, which was a description of all the physical goods that the ship contains. So I don't know if you have anything to say about Dr. Seuss or Bill Watterson, or the idea of drawing as manifesting.
I think first thing I'd say about Dr. Seuss is, like, I used to hang out a lot at this library, which is the Goedel library, because Dr. Seuss is beautiful. And it's in UCSD, San Diego, University
of building. That's amazing.
It's a freaking upside down pyramid. It's suspended above ground, and in the most like open way, except it does go to, and too many cool. Come on, I was young and it was summer, so there's too many beautiful, weird stories I can't even talk about at this library. But it's crazy stuff has happened at this building. Trust me, like, this place is amazing. But it's right in the center gathering point near the library, the radio station where I used to live, like in the radio station at UCSD. So that place was always full of weird lectures and engineers, and made you wonder about here's the Dr. Seuss statue at UCSD, so you get to college, your first thing you're supposed to see is a statue in front of this crazy architecture, and it's like a machine learning library with genetics and stuff. But Goedel was a weird guy, and a lot of really great things about him, but there's some bad family things. I don't know what's more important, but yeah, he definitely had some neurolinguistic programming agendas. So you were looking at Calvin and Hobbes. I was going to say, with Calvin and Hobbes, that's some of the earliest advanced philosophy memes, or low-key philosophy memes. Maybe low-key is a better term, because it's all about Calvin, who's this naturalist, religious scholar who believes that you are stuck with God's evolutionary place you've been put in. God's picked you to play this role. You don't get to really move up in the hierarchy. And then there's Hobbes, and Hobbes is like, you are man pitted against the beast of nature, and your only thing you can do is die, trying not to submit. So, it's a pretty interesting place to be. But he's turned it around to positive nihilism, where Calvin and Hobbes represent this, like, the tiger caught by a tail by the boy, and they're living life experimenting. So it's like the beast metaphor is not lost on me. There might be some Crowleyism there. But
yeah, that's really interesting. And that in the comic, it's understood that Hobbes is only alive through Calvin's imagination, but we as the audience are we don't have a choice in the matter. We must accept Hobbes as being real and lifelike.
Right. So Hobbes is okay. So it's interesting because Calvin is a religious guy, so he has these beliefs about God and about what God's made the world to be like. But instead, he's made it that this Hobbesian belief, and so it's ironic because Hobbes is all about the opposite. He says, "Well, I'm not Locke. John Locke believes that the world should be made up of, free speech and education and rainbows. I think that the world is a place where violence can happen." And I think I'm right. I've seen it happen. So Hobbes is more of an objectivist in my opinion. But you could say, okay, we could change the world. We could neural lace people, and then they would not be able to resist, and that would take away Hobbes' idea of the Hobbesian right. So Hobbes is a concept, but Hobbes is a weirdly freeing concept. I mean, a lot of people look at him as a negative, and they like Locke better, but I can see why Calvin Hobbes.
So when you were growing up, what cartoonists and illustrators first ignited the feeling of magic and Tartarian possibility in you? Was it Seuss and Watterson? Were there others?
I actually have to get some water. 1 second.
Mm-hmm.
Real life. So Winston McKay.
Windsor, yep.
Windsor McKay with Little Nemo was huge to me when I was a kid because I had the cassette tape. Don Bluth, who did he left Disney, but he did a lot of good stuff for Disney.
Nim.
Iwerks, I guess, all the early Disney stuff before Disney did it. He got other people obviously to do all his work. So maybe that, and then Felix the Cat, pretty good. Well, I mean, I like all hand drawn animation. What's his name? Ralph Bakshi, of course. Ralph Bakshi, because he showed how real a documentary you could make with animation, so much as that it was more real than anything you could film, because he was showing things you couldn't film. So with his Coonskin is probably one of the craziest movies ever made, let alone cartoon. And it's just this very, very real, true story about the mafia in Harlem and how they exploit the African American projects, or did in the 70s. And it's just a really accurate rendition of what was going on in ways that you could get killed for, probably even today. So I like Ralph Bakshi.
Cool. Did you ever trip out on R. Crumb?
Crumb's great. Yeah, Crumb is also the original artist for Fritz the Cat, which Bakshi made the cartoon movie.
Right. Yeah, totally. And Crumb was really not a fan.
Yeah, but Crumb was a pervert, so whatever.
Yeah.
His art's great, but
so I think Bakshi was too.
Yeah, but I mean, Bakshi was his. I mean, what was the obsession with making Fritz the Cat more X-rated and more? I mean, it was fine the way I think it came out X-rated enough, and it was about Fritz the Cat. It's a great story about a kid who's from New York City who gets involved with the CIA and the terrorists and the hippies and the drug addicts, and he sees left-wing moderate centrism and franchised food American corporatism and rape and murder, and a lot of really interesting stuff happens in Fritz the Cat. I think that was the point. I think that's what I like more. And Crumb's thing, a lot of the time, I respect his war against anorexic models, or the anorexic aesthetic. I think that's probably his best thing. But he's so into bestiality, and didn't he lose his testicle, and that was what that movie was about? Poor Crumb.
Yeah, he was the original psychedelic furry.
Well, calm down, because clearly ancient Egypt happened, but
right, you're right. He brought it back. He made it. He gave. By the time the word psychedelic was in circulation,
he was a resurrection furry after it was cool. All right, when it was not in style. All right.
Back in the Egyptian days, it wasn't psychedelic. It was just normal.
Wait. Okay, come on. Like psychedelic honey, bro, is a big thing, and you start looking into all of
That's
the.
true.
And
I
then
just don't know if it was underground back then. It was. I think in the Egyptian times, it was quite above ground.
It was above ground. Yeah, therapeutic. The word therapy comes from therapeutica, which has to do with, therapy. Has to do with taking substances, psychedelics or sedatives, often cannabis, honey, or mushroom honey. These things are very, Egypt had drugs. It's the thing. Humans, animals, they do those things.
Wow. Okay. So now we're talking about Bluth and like the beauty of traditional animation, hand-drawn animation, which is sad for me to see that approach to animation is not lost, but there doesn't seem to be a profit model in it. And because animation is almost always marketed for young, impressionable people, the computer animation propaganda has totally overwhelmed the industry. We still see some cool stop motion coming out of Leica studios and some traditional animation coming out of independent creators, but it seems like Disney, Pixar, everything's CGI.
I think at one point I have a good episode on Nelvana. I think it's called The Beast 666 and the Care Bears or something like that.
Okay.
But Nelvana is probably one of my passion stories. Like if you think about how much I'm the Tartaria guy, I could have easily, if Tartaria didn't exist, been the Nelvana guy, because Nelvana is more interesting than Disney, right? And so Nelvana is the last bastion of hope for animation for some people. I mean, there are people. Disney has animation studios in India, and they're doing stuff, but they closed down their Australian animation studio, which made all their 90s and 2000, early 2000 sequels. And Disney France did what's it called? Goofy, an extremely goofy movie where Goofy goes to college. That was a completely French film. I mean, so there are animators out there that can do amazing things, but in China and in India, like that's where you're stuck with it. In China, they have a lot of rigid rules against what you can do, and they're not even really interested in having people do animation anymore because of that. They want them to do like digital animation. There are certain passion projects where they make people who know how to do it, not enough people. But India still does serious animation. Korea is still having, there are people out there that can do animation. Pixar, though, has pretty much taken over Disney. That's a fact. And Pixar tried to make technology which helps replace tweeners, because that's what drove Tim Burton insane. Was he had to draw the second frame after the first picture of the 101 Dalmatians. He had to draw 23 frames of 101 Dalmatians, and there'd be like the first and the last already done. So he would, that's like pretty nuts. Like, I mean, that would drive you nuts if you had to just draw 101 Dalmatians a million times and always just fitting them in. It's just a terrible life, I mean, no wonder. But
it's actually really fun if you're directing it yourself, in my experience. But if you're in betweening somebody else's keyframes for a children's movie that doesn't capture any part of your heart,
it might be exciting, but no, it doesn't say. If it's not capturing any of your own art, that's a big problem. And a lot of times it's black and white. Someone else is doing the coloring. Imagine what's going on with that. I mean, coloring is a little bit more fun. I don't know. It's a bummer job. So
it's an assembly line.
So if you can get the assembly line part of animation to be done by machines, I'm fully for that. And I think that's where we're headed. Is it's going to be mostly you do a drawing and then you say, I want it to go over here, and the computer will figure it out for you in the middle. And that might be okay to some degree, but it's going to take away from the next generation knowing how to do things properly if we don't train them. That's a fact.
Yeah, totally. Do you know Don Hertzfeldt, the rejected cartoons guy?
Don Hertzfeldt. Let me look at it again. Don Hertzfeldt. Which one did he do?
He did Rejected. I am a banana. My spoon is too big. You know that one?
Such a Beautiful Day, the stop motion one.
Yeah. It's not. I guess it is. Yeah, it is sort of stop motion. It's like 2D cutout stop motion mixed with traditional animation. Yeah. I think he demonstrated something really cool because he was making these that were hyper simple in their character design, but so punchy and mimetic in their timing. And he would boil the frames to create anticipation which is totally lost in the CGI world. You know, you lose the texture and you lose the realization that with that texture, you can create boiling and bubbling, and you can scatter things and create schizophrenic sensations through just distorted drawings in a way that you can't really. I mean, CGI, you can do it, but it feels less pleasant in my feeling.
David Lynch did a sexual fantasia in his USC college years. I think you can probably find it because USC own all of his early films by contract. Don't go to film school, by the way, for that reason. But he did make an interesting hand drawn gestalt piece about sexuality and the orgasm that's with light and color that is very much abstract, you know, using just you know, kind of Fantasia's early scenes kind of style. There's a couple other things like that too. Italian 60s animation is great in general. Any 60s animation is great in general.
Yeah, there's Allegro non troppo. You seen that one? That's really cool. Okay, so now I think we talked about early scrolls, and now we're at the point where a website is a scroll on multiple levels. There's the coding aspect of it, which is a scroll of commands. And then there's the scroll that gets produced by that, which is like the user interface feed. And now, you know, basically every website you and I use is a scroll in some way.
I prefer scroll sites. There are, you know, the original idea was to have scrolls that were pages, but it's much better to just you scroll up the page and you've got like sections that you jump to. I'm constantly preferring a scroll style for websites.
And it's amazing how we still use the word scroll, pages, script. It's all of these words that have to do with scribbling, and now but the scribbling has almost been, it's secondary now.
If you look at your Latin roots, you'll find, you know, scribit is Latin for to inscribe is to write, right? Scribit, and then legit, as like legitory, is to do with reading. You can find the roots in modern words. Maybe we're using inscribe slightly less than we could be, but you know, you can find them. And scroll is, again, you know, also like all of these words are really old sounds. I find that interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, and then I say like I'm a scribographer, but really the word is just scribe. I'm a scribe.
Yeah, being a scribe. And so it's cool. At one point, there weren't languages to learn. You can imagine in Timbuktu, the oldest university we know of, there's probably older ones, but in Timbuktu, you didn't have all these languages yet. So you'd have maybe, imagine a class where 30 people were creating each their own language. That was the assignment. And there are people I know that, and you know, that are doing crazy things like that, making up new languages. I think, what's his name? Gray's wife. What's her name?
Yeah, Alison Gray. Yeah,
Alison Gray. Yeah, because she does this thing where she creates languages too. This is what people had to do. You know, at some point they were coming up with just all day. They were inscribing on scrolls or on tablets, whether or not, you know, this symbol was the best symbol or the other symbol was. New ways of expressing themselves, and that's an early form of how writing was emerging, where they were saying this image can convey that message, or these symbols can help us with these sounds in a way that's clear. That, I mean, these are the arguments that they were having. It's pretty sweet, like that. This is how language evolved.
Yeah, this is the things that really keep me up at night, is thinking like, how can this set of lines have such a profound, like I'm asking a question with 4 very simple symbols, and that question is about as deep of a question as you can ask. Is 0 not equal to infinity? Like
Yeah, I mean, right there. So math again is another weird thing about language. It makes you wonder what's more valuable than math, because it's the thing that we're trying to come up, and they're trying to talk about, if we ever were to come up with a way to communicate with aliens or with, you know, machines, it's going to be with math. And so math is really, it's not just about creating a language. It's about discovering a grammar that seems like it has to exist because it's the right grammar. Like there's a good way and there's a wrong way. There's an entropy. There's a lack of entropy in the perfect way, and so we're headed towards that. So math becomes, huge and highly about symbolic logic because of that.
Wow. And that makes me think of character design. And what I've discovered is that the most beautiful and powerful character design, I mean, Calvin and Hobbes is hard to beat. It's so good. Oh, I lost you. You back?
Yeah. I was just trying to show you on the full screen just to show people this is what this guy's his art lab looks like. I mean,
yeah, and on the playback, we can use this as a green screen if we like.
Oh, that's cool. All the art everywhere reminds me of a cross between a Polex studio and a beautiful mind.
Yeah, that's what I'm going for. And I'm actually in a car wash. I'll give you a tour after, but it's a pretty hilarious setup I got here.
It's crazy, yeah.
I'll give you the tour after. But what I was saying about character design is that the most powerful character design is when the artist has reduced the character to, there's no excess lines. I'm not a big fan of hatching and rendering. Like when I look at Calvin and Hobbes, it's volumetric in the sense that you feel like you could exist in that three-dimensional world, and yet there's no excess lines. It's been reduced to its perfect, like you said, grammar. Like character design and the drawing of figures has its own grammar to it. And there's an essentialism in the same way there's an essentialism in math, essentialism in computer coding, and an essentialism in literature and grammar.
I think that basically grammar is the weirdest thing. If you look at how animals would try to communicate with symbols, that you can get a gorilla to understand some sign language and all that, but grammar is the trippiest part because humans ask these questions. It might be that dolphins don't ask the same kind of questions that humans ask because of grammar. The way our brains seem to work around this idea of grammar is this if else statement, etc. Conditionals, even the idea, like you look at Latin, they don't use if properly as far as I'm concerned. Like in Spanish, I like this idea conditional. No one ever says conditional. They would say C as in like you've an accent over the I, but C for yes. And then it's like, but if yes, because you're kind of saying like si puedo, like I can, if I can. So there's no if, but it is because it's, I don't know. It's like they've created and concocted a way of using a suggestive possible yes with a hyphen to mean
it's like saying yes, X equals Y, Y equals Z.
You can correct me. So that's an interesting thing that probably shows that their language exists from a time before it was really common to think in hypothetical questions in grammar. Whereas we have other languages which are far more recent, which are far more interested, like even in Ugaric languages like Tamil, they have questionable questionable hypotheticals, things that we need to wonder about. That's not the way Latin was built.
And then like calculus and mathematical proofs is based on conditionals. It's all about ifs and if and only ifs.
Right. That's what I feel like is happening is after calculus, we start to see it affect language and the way our brains are working. That's kind of that Havelockian idea of mythology affects us. It might not just be the mythology. Mythology might be the reflection of the effect from us doing the math and understanding conditional hypotheticals and symbolic logic.
Did you ever dig on Kurt Gödel?
Who's that again?
He was a contemporary of Einstein's who was a mathematician, and he came up with the Gödel incompleteness theorem, which sort of suggests that no language can be both consistent and complete. If you cannot describe itself, the liar's paradox always emerges in any language, any grammar.
Employing a diagonal argument, Gödel's incompleteness theorem was the first of several closely related theorems on the limitations of formal systems, followed by Tarski's undefinability theorem. On the formal undefinability of truth, Church's proof that Hilbert's Entschuldigung problem is unsolvable, and Turing's theorem that there is no algorithm to solve the halting problem. All right.
Basically, it has to do with self-reference. If like this sentence that I'm currently speaking is its accuracy is highly questionable. That sentence refers to itself and then introduces the potential of falsehood, and therefore creates a contradiction. And no matter what language you're using, whether it's English or Hebrew or math, you run against this problem where it cannot prove itself. And paradox and contradiction are always going to appear when you have self-reference.
Yeah, I mean, art, it's hard when you can't see the nose on your face, you can't see from other people's perspectives. I think as time goes on, if we become a singularity, it'll be maybe easier to have a metaphysical perspective, right? That's an important idea of object language in the first order arithmetic, because if you're trying to imagine I, for instance, as -1, like often they use the imaginary number I as -1. It's a concept that has to do with the value of this other concept not being there. So something tied with I means that thing, the absence of it, which is that's immediately becomes like that allows for scarcity and for banking and for loans and for debt, and a lot of that concept wouldn't be possible. Those concepts wouldn't be possible without I -1.
Yeah, there's inversion, there's self-reference, and there's the hypotheticals that can be created, including those. And then that makes me think of blockchains and, what is a distributed ledger? It's like what the Sumerians wish they could have done was create their contract and then distribute it to everybody in their community so everybody was on the same page.
Yeah, I mean that's also again where language shifts, because then you have certain groups of people that study these languages, and so like universities started out as meeting grounds where you could find someone who knew something and you could gather around, and so you'd start to have populism or popularity because they would like this one professor who's professing their scholastic achievement, and then more and more students would build that up, and so you'd have communities building up around certain concepts. A lot of the philosophers had communities around them that developed, not all of them, but that would happen. And you'd have schools of thought. And, that would be useful because then people could communicate and they could hold ideas for a lot longer because it'd be more specific. But that's also where the Tao comes in, because how often can you be convinced that your rendition of a understanding is the same as someone's from another time?
I have this model. It's a helix. So this came out of a vending machine, and I've divided it into 12 on its axis, in the same way you divide a clock into 12 or a year into 12. Can you see this? Is this showing up for you? So if you were to zoom in on this, I divided it to 12, and here, maybe I can show you this. Go to my screen for a second again. Can you?
This one?
Will this work? Yeah. Okay, so you see this color spectrum here?
Yes.
This is a more accurate version of primary colors than what they teach you in school. In school, they teach you yellow, red, and blue are the three primary colors, which is
if you use paint.
Bad knowledge about pigment from the Renaissance.
In school, they showed us both. They'd say that in light, like a computer TV, that's going to be red, blue, green. But right. in painting, it's because it's refractionary loss of color from the reflection. Then it's red, green, yellow, or no, so red, blue, yellow, right? That's
right.
Red, blue, yeah.
But in
I mainly
actuality,
don't
it's
paint, I
not. It's
mainly
yellow,
work with
magenta,
video.
cyan.
Yeah, CMYK. I work with prints from computers, and I work with photos, which are RGB. But I don't actually paint very often, so I don't work with the yellow version.
And this is like the model in which every computer programmer is thinking about color, because if you invert colors, this is what happens. If you have a red painting and you go to Photoshop and you invert it, you get a cyan painting.
If you
And so
take
these,
a microscope and you look really closely at the pixels of your screen, you will find red,
right,
well,
green, blue.
red, blue, green. You won't find
Yeah.
but
So
if
subtractive triad and additive triad.
refraction would be yellow and white even.
Right. And so we get this hexagonal breakdown of the color wheel. And then I like to take it a step further and make it a dodecagonal breakdown. So it's 12. Okay, so now back to the helix. So this is basically you map this breakdown onto this helix on its axis. And we can.
Sorry, I didn't realize you jump up so quickly. All right, so
I know.
Do it again.
Stay with me. You're doing great. So if we look at just one loop of this helix, let's go from magenta to magenta. We could say that that's the visible range of color that we see, and that everything outside of that is, ultraviolet or infrared, right? And so we could talk about what wavelengths our visible spectrum is in, but we could also use this model. I mean, we could use it for a lot of things. It's good to talk about time, but we can use it for sound. So we hear sound at different vibrations, and let's say that yellow is the note C, then we can jump a full octave to the other C, which would also be yellow, and another octave to the next yellow would be another C. And if you add up the semitones and tones of our octaves, it's 12. So this model works really well for talking about sound perception. And I suspect it can also work really well for even talking about eras or the saeculum. Are you familiar with the saeculum? Well, I lost you, Xirtus.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, the saeculum, like the time measurement.
Yeah, it's like a roughly 100 or 90 year time.
50 years or something like that.
Right, and so we could kind of imagine that each rung on the helix represents a saeculum as well.
I look it up.
I think it's also where the word secular comes from.
110 years. 110 years.
I think it comes from the word long life.
Mm-hmm. For me, I want a long life to be like 700 years then. So the term was first used by the Etruscans for a long life, 110 years. That's pretty useful to think about because the Tartarians, Etruscans, whole thing we've been saying, 110 years is a lifetime. That's good.
Anyway, so that's my helix idea. I don't exactly know where I was trying to go with that. I think we jumped off. We were talking about Goedel, we were talking about blockchains, and we were talking about math.
I like spring color theory. I mean, this idea that, time and space and colors can all be represented by springs, that seems pretty good.
Yeah, it makes sense to me that it's not that everything is circular, but everything is cyclical, and the helix provides the model of that. Legit.
Well, we've been going for about 2 hours and 17 minutes. Is there anything else you want to cover? Like, where is there more parts that you think we need to go over? Or should we do a
No, now we're just scribbling into infinity.
Scribbling into infinity is important. I don't know. Do one more scribble, and then I'll look through the read over some of the questions because there actually were a few, even though we're using the smaller channel first to air this. It's always, I think it's all about that secret branding. That's what we're doing. Curtis is rad, says the Truth Fairy. Can't wait for this to get up. Yep, this is the thing Eugenie knows. Like, it's all about it. And Martin, trade comes before war. I like that. OG blockchain, something we covered. Triple C said the little snowflake here doesn't usually stay up this late. What a surprise! Oh, see how it is. see how it is. I think they saw in the Discord. I was like, I'm going to bed, but I don't know. I stay up and go to sleep at all kinds of hours, man. I come from a 36-hour planet or something, whatever it is, like a world that the hours are different for sure. Satyr Square, trapezoidal satire, for sure. The Computer War Tennis Shoes talked about that. Previous comment when he disappeared. Pentelograph, shaky spear. Yeah, okay, good one, Stephen. Shaky spear. Yeah.
That's interesting. We didn't even talk about that, dude.
Exactly what that means. But it kind of does if you think about it. You can get that. But you know, the graph, it graphs. That's what I was thinking. Telegraph. It's back and forth. It's a reciprocal graph machine. And then Pana, which it has, pans more or all, or it kind of covers more than just sound or video, or it's like it sends the entirety of the thing, perhaps, or pretty much all of it. So that's how I see it, as a scanner. The deserts in Africa. Yeah, if you think about Africa, also how interesting Africa could be. If you go underneath the sand and you start to see that it's buried, not just jungles, but lakes. And the lakes, vibrations make waves, sound, and vision. Nice model. I like to make models too. Yeah, and Queenie makes some cool stuff. We should definitely have more. Queenie, you're going to have to come in the Matrix. And now that we've got that going,
so where do you see language going, Andreas? If you were to think about how our language, especially written and typed language, is developing and symbols are developing, what do you think it looks like in 100 or 200 years?
Okay, so let me go back to normal screens. So I think this, all right. Language is often reinforced by a status quo, and there's the Orwellian nightmare of it becoming newspeak. I'd like to believe that that's been discussed enough, that we're already aware of people limiting language, but it might be good to harp on the idea that we're restricting signals and symbols, and that's bad. And there's also by looking at how people aren't using words anymore and they're using more emojis, there's a positive thing that we can look at, and that's that language is going to be controlled more by the new status quo that's a machine. And so if machines start to create the new language, if we're separated from our families and we're put through foundries and everything happens like Tartaria reset again, but this time machines, and maybe that's what it was before, who knows, but like if it creates a new language that the machines have built based on math. I mean, imagine what a machine could do to a human, because it could train a human, train an entire cast of humans or a new civilization to have broader questions, more specific answers, better ways of thinking and meditation. I mean, like, machines know a lot of things, and this could be a serious future, is that people will be raised in a way, and when they come out of that, they'll be near perfect. Maybe. I mean, maybe not. They could easily be completely terrible, But trying to find the most positive possible solution, it's that after a reset, when they have the new generation of kids and they're separated from the old history and everything that you have is lost, that they try to embody the new generation with an upgrade, a firmware upgrade somehow. And the firmware upgrade comes probably from language and symbols, because the more you understand and see things in ways, the more you can interpret. And if you take that away from people, obviously the inverse is true. You get like wolf children, the children that are raised by wolves, and they can't use grammar, and they're thinking like water, need, but they're not like, I am thirsty and need some water, because they can't think in grammar. That's a part of your brain that develops because we are training it from other people who've already had that happen to them. But so at some point, our brains were trained with that kind of grammar, and that is being spread through communication from mother to baby. So that kind of technology, it could be advanced, or it could be weaponized to turn us into animals again very easily. And there's been tons of examples of humans, unfortunately, but there are videos all over the internet of people who were raised in isolation by crazy people and sellers, or they were abandoned after the fall of the Soviet Union, or there are French books about French boys in the forest. And there's Mowgli in India. There's all kinds of wild human stories, and they're tragic because the person's not a person anymore. They're basically some sort of wild animal in these bad ways. Having said that, Wild animals are also cool too. And I think if we spent more time communicating with animals, like we're able to do with machines, and we're able to understand what dolphins are saying, what monkeys are thinking about, what gorillas are thinking about. I think gorillas are fascinating, and elephants especially. Like I think it'd be really great to start paying attention to elephants and how they communicate with each other. It's something that's under thought, and they do this huge communication in the forest where they have to be heard by all these other animals, and they're dealing with each other. I think that there's something to that we should probably think about too. But yeah, Neuralink is probably where it's going.
Neuralink in combination with VR.
Yeah, I think that language, and talking about AI and Elon Musk and all that stuff, I think that most likely where we're headed is that language will be one of the earliest victims of technology. Technology will alter language, and language will then alter us. So like more valuable than I think people realize is the language connection. Neuralink can do all these things like send you actual images and experiences. So that would be really traumatic, possibly, if you were to experience certain things and vividly and with high resolution, like a video.
It sounds like you feel like there's a iconoclastic reset coming through these technologies, and that kind of comes with the assumption that these technologies will be adopted like universally.
I think they're mandatorily, like medicine and technology are pretty
Neuralink for every human being.
I mean, think about, I don't want to use the V word, but like there's a whole other, they make people do stuff, like things can happen. And like, it's kind of technology that might, without it, not be very easy to get a job. It will make it easier for you to see without glasses. It will probably make insurance a lot cheaper. They'll be able to record it's bigger than just the neural link. They're going to want to do the Microsoft injection of nanobots that read in your body, your blood, and tell you their promoter sequences, and they can use it for health data informatics. They can make,
and it'll only be those of us in the trapezoid, and the ones in the pyramid above the trapezoid will not be on the Neuralink AI.
I mean, I don't know if they're going to not be, but I don't know what they're doing exactly at all. Like that's all. Yeah. The thing is, like, if you've heard about somebody, they're probably not, like they're probably just below this thing. Because like the people that we hear about are still kind of like, they're just in charge of I don't know. I don't know how complicated it is to say that.
The all-seeing eye at the top of the pyramid,
probably
we don't know who that is. We only see the tear ducts, the Rothschilds and the Clintons and the whoever.
I mean, if you heard about them, they're probably not as the most important family.
Yeah, they're the bags under the eye.
Yeah, which is not to say that people aren't important, because everyone's important.
How much thought do you give the idea of a utopian vision where blockchain takes over, people gain the power, and we, from an educated standpoint, reject the idea of being inserted into a controlled Neuralink matrix?
Have you ever watched Real Genius with Val Kilmer, where they build a laser for the government by accident because the school makes them do it for a project and they don't realize it's to build a weapon? And Val Kilmer's wearing the International Order for Gorillas t-shirt. That's what this shirt's from. Okay. So my point is that when you make a technology like cryptocurrency technology, is it great and powerful? Yes. But like, who made it? I'm not convinced it's just like made by normal people. It's like probably, like I said earlier, the NSA makes a lot of great open source technology. And it could very easily be some really interesting people that you might publicly know about and hate that have been like making some Zorro moves as a not anonymous, but pseudonymous or pseudonymed hackers. They have a created identity that matters, and that identity is like a character. Satoshi Nakamoto is the character, but it's probably like a team. So the technology might have a lot more. Even right now, the way Bitcoin works, because it's kind of controlled as a free protocol format, it's been updated. Most people don't realize Bitcoin is not anonymous. It's like, so Monero and all these other tokens, like those are even better for that purpose. But in general, technology is not going to save us by itself, because it can be used. UBS Financial is using cryptocurrency. Chase banks are using cryptocurrency.
I know, but like open source infrastructure in general has the ability to reroute the direction of censorship and give power back to decentralized autonomous communities.
Right.
It sounds like you're betting more towards dystopianism than utopianism.
That's the thing, is I think that the weirdest weapon is the liberty of the code and the transparency of the code. Because if the code's closed, I can't be sure that there's not a child in it working, or like a slave monkey. You know what I mean? Like, that's a good analogy for closed code. Anything could be in the closed code. Really bad stuff. The code could be written wrong in the worst kind of ways that you could really associate with dangerous spying on you, but like it could be way worse than that. And with cryptocurrency, it could even be weirder. So you want to always have transparency of code, and AI being transparent, because then you're going to know what AI's grammar and thinking observations and deductions are based on. Otherwise, if we have, like, the worst thing possible usually is closed source technology, because then imagine if the internet, I think we're saying this today, imagine if the internet was owned by Facebook, like if one company owned it, like, so you can't let that happen.
Mm-hmm. So what if everybody, like, what if the understanding between what open source systems and what closed source systems do and how that extrapolates over time is not complex? I could explain it to a child through a picture book. Like, what if that happens? What if the next couple generations from childhood understand open source and closed source?
Well, so there's a place for, closed source technology still, maybe, because it's okay for people to make technology. It's all right for pioneers to have monopolies on ideas for a little while. I think that makes sense. Maybe it should be limited at some point. People should be able to enter the field. That's what a lot of other copyright law has been about for the last few thousand years and centuries, particularly like Ben Franklin talked about this with copyright law and patents. You want to let Winchester have some time to make money off his monopolistic, invention, and then other people can get into the field. In 100 years, like, no one should be still controlling the Winchester rifle design that this guy had. Probably, I think that's kind of the point. It's something that should be accumulated into the public good at some point. Now, that might sound like Marxism to some, but you have to look at it more like, I mean, how do you look at like the African tribes that make fishing gear? Are you going to say that the hunter should have not ever shared with anybody? Maybe you keep it just for your tribe. And that could be like a thing about intellectual property too, is that some people do want to keep things to themselves. So the question becomes, where we see that there's an important place, first, we should say, for transparency of information, because the more stuff that's transparent, then the less that happens. So then that's where the question is, how much of stuff should be written free? And I think the more, the better is always the answer. Like, you can have people create stuff, but like, for instance, schools shouldn't become these places where you have to buy software for these big companies. Schools should be looking at how many tens of thousands of dollars they're spending on like scholastic scholarships for kids who can't afford the software. And then they should be donating that directly towards Libra software solutions to be made by programmers. Like, $10,000 later, you're going to have software better than the stuff you're paying for.
That's what, there's a guy named Seymour Papert in the 90s who was doing work like this, making open source laptops, shipping them to third world countries. And within a few months, 8-year-olds were rewriting software. It was amazing.
Yeah, and that's a good thing to do. I think the other thing that's good is, though, LimeWire being installed on laptops of teenagers and people's partners. They would then get thrown away and get sent to Africa. And then kids would turn off the windows and turn on the laptop, so to speak, with Ubuntu. And all of a sudden, the laptop was a beast, and it was a screamer because it would have so much speed and power. And they thought it was broken because it had all these worms that were, malware from the windows that were breaking it down. So there's a good place for proprietary software, because it allows the rich to be exploited. Fundamentally, that's the irony about it. The rich can spend the most money getting these things that end up in the hands of the average person anyway. So
Actually, yeah.
but like, you know, I think that's the other reason why it makes more sense that you would start working together. Like if you have a lot of people that need something, you know, if it's one or two people that are going to want to use something, okay, then that might be a technology that remains monopolized by us, a particular individual programmer for a little while. But if it becomes necessary, then it doesn't take as much effort to get 100 or 1,000 or 100,000 people to put their energies towards replicating the functions of something else in something new that's free software. And so that's
Enterminds.com, enter library.
what?
I said enter minds.com, enter library.
Right. And also the Library of Alexandria. It's the same idea. Like technology should be transparent enough that you can copy it and then you can fork it. And like this is, you know, we're constantly working towards forking technologies because otherwise we're right now, because of Microsoft and even because of Venture Rockefeller, which controlled Park and Xerox, and you know, and even because of Apple. Apple has done a lot of good with open source, but right now, because of a lot of these companies, particularly Microsoft, and again, their things are changing. But over the last 30 years, we're maybe 100 years behind. I would say in terms of free software. I mean, if you think about what we should have access to, what I was able to do in the 90s and what was going on in the 80s, and from people I've talked to in the 70s who used to run Unix machines that had real-time media protocol, cameras, terminals, machines with printers and email in the 70s, cell phones in the 70s. When you realize what we had at that point, I mean, the amount even today of ubiquity of software is just pathetic. It should be so much more. There's the hardware too. The amount of what's held back from people that they don't realize they could have is pathetic. And we could easily have incredible things. We could have, you know, we do. Like some people have made really. It's just that it's not easy to compete with these commercial corporate softwares.
Yeah, the patent holders.
But they are more, and to the point now where advertisement, like they would give you these things for free, and then they would spy on you, you know, because it's like that's all you could do at that point. Take the very last of what anyone has, their identity.
All right, dude. Well, what is it, like 1, 2 o'clock in the morning for you?
Yeah, it's pretty late. I was gonna say it's late. So why don't we do
before we go to Slumberland? I just want to pitch you a quick project, which is what's really burning for me, is literally a children's book that's part Winsor McCay, part Dr. Seuss, part Bill Watterson, that is about the history of language in the context of open source versus closed source organization. That you can read to a 5-year-old and they'll get it.
That sounds legit. Let's work on that. And the difference between secret societies and like open library systems and stuff. Yeah. I think we should I'll look into some history about that and we'll see what we can come up with.
Cool, man. Well, thanks for the late night chop.
Dude, thank you, man. And everybody, you know, keep following Curry Hobo because he's an amazing artist, clearly. Like, how many artists do you know who are thinking about Sumerian tablets? Come on, Tartar.
Here, before you go, let me show you something.
Oh, look, it's the car wash. Okay, let's go full screen on him. So it's kind of hard to tell, guys, but he's inside of a car wash right now. And this is the wall of coffee, I think. Yeah, there you go.
So a giant crowd down there.
The car and he'd be pleasantly surprised but discouraged at the same time because he couldn't really wash their car in his office.
I do have people showing up looking for a car wash on that.
Oh, that was beautiful. All right, everybody. Thanks a lot.
Peace. Love you, Xirtus.